The train pulled into Harlan Creek Station at 2:30 in the afternoon, and Caroline Mercer stepped onto the platform with a carpet bag in each hand and a third trunk being wrestled off the luggage car by a porter who clearly resented the weight of it. She stood there a moment, blinking against the flat white glare of the August sun, and looked up and down the platform. There was no one waiting for her. She had imagined this moment more times than she could count during the 4-day journey from St. Louis. She had imagined Thomas Grayson standing on the platform in his Sunday coat, hat in hand, maybe nervous, maybe relieved. She had imagined the awkward first handshake, the polite exchange of pleasantries, the drive out to the ranch in a wagon that probably needed new wheels. She had imagined all of it. She had not imagined this, the platform half empty, the station master already turning back toward his office, and no one who looked anything like the photograph Thomas had sent her tucked inside his last letter. The photograph was in her coat pocket. She'd checked it so many times over the past week that the paper had begun to soften along the fold lines. She set her bags down and waited. 5 minutes. 10. The porter asked her twice if she needed help with her trunk, and twice she told him no, she was waiting for someone. He gave her a look that she chose not to interpret. It was nearly 2:45 when she heard running footsteps on the wooden boards behind her. She turned. The boy was maybe 12 years old, barefoot despite the heat of the planks beneath him, wearing trousers that had been hemmed too short and a shirt with a collar that was coming loose at one side. He had dark hair, badly cut, and the kind of eyes that had recently been crying and were working very hard to pretend they hadn't been. He stopped a few feet from her, chest heaving, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was somewhere between desperation and dread. "Are you Miss Mercer?" he asked. "I am," she said. He swallowed. His jaw tightened. He was clearly gathering himself for something he did not want to say. "I'm Eli Grayson," he said. "Thomas Grayson was my father." She noticed the past tense immediately. The world seemed to go very quiet around her. The sound of the other passengers, the hiss of the cooling engine, the distant noise of the town, all of it seemed to pull back, like a tide retreating from shore. "Was," she said. Eli Grayson nodded. His chin was trembling slightly, and he was fighting it. "He died 9 days ago. Fever. It came on fast." He paused. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't know how to write it in a letter in time. I thought if I came myself—" He stopped, pressing his lips together. "I'm sorry." Caroline stood very still. She didn't know what she felt exactly. She had not loved Thomas Grayson. You couldn't love someone you'd only known through letters, not the way people meant when they used that word. But she had known his handwriting. She had known the way he described his land, always in terms of what it could become rather than what it was. She had known that he worried about his children more than he ever said directly, the worry surfacing instead in the gaps between sentences, in the things he mentioned and then moved quickly past. She had known enough of him to cross half the country to meet him. And now she was standing on a platform in a town she'd never seen before, with all her possessions in 2 bags and a trunk, and the man she'd come to marry was 9 days in the ground. "How many children?" she heard herself ask. Eli blinked. It clearly wasn't the question he'd expected. 7, he said, "including me." "How old is the youngest?" "Lily." His voice caught slightly on the name. "She's 4 months. She's not doing well, ma'am." Caroline looked down at her bags. Then she looked back at the boy in front of her. He was standing straight, doing everything he could to hold himself together, but he was 12 years old and he had lost his father 9 days ago, and he was standing on a train platform talking to a stranger because there was apparently no one else to do it. "Is there a wagon?" she asked. Eli stared at her. "Ma'am? Did you come in a wagon or on horseback?" "Wagon," he said slowly. "But the train going back east leaves at 4 o'clock. You could still—" "I know when the train leaves," she said. She picked up both her bags. "Can you manage the trunk, or should we ask the porter?" Eli kept staring at her. Something was shifting in his expression. The wariness not gone exactly, but something else moving underneath it. "I can manage it," he said. The ride out to the Grayson Ranch took the better part of an hour, and for most of it neither of them said much. The land they crossed was the kind of country that people in St. Louis described as wide open when they meant to sound admiring and meant empty and unforgiving when they thought more carefully about it. The grass was tawny and dry. The sky was enormous. The road was little more than two ruts worn into the earth by wheels passing over the same ground for enough years that the grass had stopped bothering to grow back. Caroline sat beside Eli on the wagon bench and studied what she could see of the landscape and tried to think clearly. She was 31 years old. She had spent the last several years in St. Louis working as a seamstress, first in a shop and then from her own rooms after the shop owner had let half the staff go during a slow winter. She had never been married. She had come close once, years ago, but that was a different story and not one she was interested in revisiting on a wagon bench in the middle of the Kansas Territory. She had corresponded with Thomas Grayson for 8 months after answering his advertisement in the Gazette. His letters had been practical and honest, which she'd appreciated. He hadn't pretended to be offering more than he was. He'd written that he had 7 children and a struggling ranch and that he needed a capable woman more than a romantic companion, and that if that sounded harsh, he apologized, but he'd rather be truthful than have her arrive expecting something different from what was there. She had respected that. She had written back in kind, and now she was here anyway, and he was gone. And she was riding toward a homestead she'd never seen to meet 6 children she didn't know, with no real claim on any of it and no clear idea what she was doing. She looked at Eli's profile. He was watching the road with the focused attention of someone who had driven this route alone before and was doing so again because there was no one else. "Tell me about them," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "Who?" "Your brothers and sisters." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, like someone testing ice before stepping on it, "There's me. Then Hannah. She's 10. Then the twins, Samuel and Bess, they're 8. Then Owen, he's 6. Then Ruth, she just turned 3. He paused. "Then Lily." "Who's been looking after them since your father passed?" "Hannah, mostly." He said it without any particular expression, which was its own kind of expression. "And the Halverson family, so they're our nearest neighbors, about 4 miles east. Mrs. Halverson has come by twice. She brought food the first time." "Are you managing?" He was quiet again. Not the thoughtful kind of quiet. The kind where the answer was no, and he was deciding whether to say it. "The well's running low," he said finally. "The crops are already dead from the dry spell. We've got enough flour and salt pork to last maybe 3 weeks if we're careful." He kept his eyes on the road. "Papa had a lot of plans for the fall. He was going to—" He stopped, started again. There were plans. Caroline didn't say anything for a moment. She looked out at the dry grass moving in the hot wind and thought about 3 weeks of flour and salt pork and a 4-month-old infant who wasn't doing well. "What's wrong with Lily?" she asked. "She won't take enough milk. She cries a lot. She doesn't look right." His voice was controlled, but his hands on the reins tightened. "Hannah's been doing her best, but Hannah's 10. Is there a doctor in Harlan Creek? There's a man who calls himself one. He came out once. He said to keep her warm and try a sugar rag." His tone conveyed exactly what he thought of that advice. The wagon rolled on. A hawk was circling something in the grass to the north. The sun was starting its slow tilt westward, the heat not letting up even a fraction. "I need to ask you something," Eli said. "Go ahead." He turned and looked at her directly for the first time since the platform. His eyes were dark and sharp and much older than 12. "Why are you still here?" She thought about how to answer that. "I don't entirely know yet," she said honestly. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned back to the road, and for the first time since she'd met him, the set of his shoulders loosened the smallest degree. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road, and Caroline's first thought was that Thomas Grayson's letters had been even more optimistic than she'd realized. The main house was a 1-story structure built from rough timber and adobe brick, with a covered porch that sagged at one end where a support post had either rotted or been knocked loose and not yet replaced. The barn behind it was larger than the house, which was not unusual out here, but one of its walls had developed a visible lean. The fencing around the near pasture was intact in some sections and entirely absent in others. A kitchen garden along the south side of the house showed the withered brown remains of what might have been tomatoes and beans before the drought. 2 horses in the pasture looked thin, but not dangerously so. And on the porch, arranged in a rough line as though they had been waiting and had perhaps rehearsed the arrangement, were 5 children. Hannah was the oldest of the ones present, a serious-faced girl with her brother's dark hair and an expression that had clearly been doing a lot of heavy lifting lately. She was holding a bundle against her chest, Lily, Caroline realized, with the careful, rigid posture of someone terrified of dropping something precious. The twins, Samuel and Bess, stood side by side in matching solemnity. Owen, 6 years old, was slightly behind the others and had clearly been crying recently and was trying not to show it. Ruth, just turned 3, had abandoned whatever formation had been planned and was simply sitting on the porch step with a wooden spoon in her hand, watching Caroline with enormous eyes. Eli pulled the wagon to a stop. Caroline climbed down before he could come around to help her. She walked to the base of the porch steps and stopped. No one said anything for a moment. Hannah's eyes moved over her with an assessment that was startling in its directness for a 10-year-old. Caroline had the distinct impression of being measured. "You're Miss Mercer," Hannah said. Not a question. "I am." "You didn't have to stay." "No," Caroline agreed. "I didn't." Another silence. Then Ruth held up the wooden spoon, apparently as an offering. "That's kind of you," Caroline said. She climbed the steps and crouched down to Ruth's level. "Can I ask, is that for cooking or for something else?" Ruth considered the question with great seriousness. "Both," she decided. Behind her, Caroline heard the faint, thread-thin cry of an infant, and all the warmth she'd been trying to hold on to during that exchange contracted suddenly into something tight and practical. She straightened and looked at Hannah. "May I?" Hannah looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, she held out the bundle. Caroline took Lily Grayson into her arms and drew back the edge of the worn blanket to look at her. The baby was very small, too small probably for 4 months. Her face was pale and slightly yellowish, and her cry was weak, the kind of cry that didn't have much energy behind it, that was more a statement of discomfort than a demand. Her eyes, when they opened briefly, were glassy. Caroline had no formal medical training. She had, however, spent 3 years helping her aunt run a household that included 4 children, one of whom had been sickly through his first year, and she had learned certain things through necessity. "How much has she been eating?" she asked. "Not much," Hannah said. "She takes a little and then she stops. Sometimes she spits it back." "How long has she been like this?" "Since before Papa—" Hannah stopped, her jaw set. "About 2 weeks." Caroline looked at the baby's color, at the slight jaundice in her skin, at the way her little hands were limp rather than curled. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the nearest real doctor was likely to be a significant distance away. "Do you have any canned milk?" she asked. "Some, not much." "Honey?" Hannah nodded. "I want to try something. It may not work, but I want to try." She looked up at Hannah. "Will you show me where the kitchen is?" Whoosh. The kitchen was cramped and dark and smelled of stale grease and the particular exhaustion of a space that had been used hard by someone who didn't have time to clean it properly. But there was a working stove and firewood and a small pantry with the canned milk Hannah had mentioned, plus a collection of other supplies that were more meager than they should have been for a family of this size heading into fall. Caroline set Lily down in a padded basket near the warmth of the stove and began looking through the pantry with the focused, cataloging attention of a woman assessing a problem. Flour, salt pork, as Eli had said, a small amount of dried beans, 2 tins of peaches, cornmeal, 3 jars of preserved tomatoes, coffee, enough for another week, the canned milk, 4 tins, a jar of honey, mostly full, some dried herbs in paper packets that she'd have to look at more closely. Behind her, she was aware of the children distributing themselves around the kitchen, Hannah staying close, the twins and Owen hovering in the doorway, Ruth having followed Caroline inside and situated herself under the table with her wooden spoon. "What are you making?" Samuel asked from the doorway. "Something for Lily," Caroline said, "to see if it helps." She found a small tin pot and set it on the stove. "Can one of you get the fire going? It looks like it's nearly out." There was a brief, unspoken negotiation in the doorway. Then Bess stepped forward and, with an efficiency that suggested she'd been doing this for a while, got the stove fire rebuilt. Caroline watched her from the corner of her eye and said nothing. She made the mixture carefully. Diluted canned milk, the small amount of honey, water she'd let boil and cool. It wasn't a doctor's prescription. It was something her aunt had done once, learned from a neighbor who'd learned it from someone else. One of those unwritten pieces of knowledge that got passed between women because women were often the only ones available when the alternatives ran out. She sat down in the kitchen chair and picked up Lily and spent the next 40 minutes coaxing the baby to take small amounts from a cloth-tipped spoon. Lily resisted at first. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, she began to accept it. No one spoke while this was happening. When Lily finally drifted into something that looked more like real sleep than exhausted collapse, Caroline sat holding her and looked at the ring of children around her. "She needs consistent feeding," she said, "small amounts, regularly, every 2 hours through the night if she'll take it." She paused. "That means someone needs to be awake every 2 hours. Hannah was already nodding. "I've been doing that." "Not anymore," Caroline said. "I'll take the nights. You've been doing too much already." Hannah's expression shifted. Some careful architecture she'd constructed coming slightly apart before she put it back together. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Caroline said. "I'm choosing to." Silence. Owen, from the doorway, said very quietly, "Are you going to stay?" The question hung in the kitchen with the wood smoke and the smell of warm milk. Caroline thought about the train, the 4 o'clock train that had left Harlan Creek hours ago now, the trunk sitting in the wagon outside that still needed to be brought in. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to stay." Sham. The first 2 weeks were brutal in the way that necessary things often are. There was no time for grief or for the kind of careful adjustment that a new situation was supposed to allow. The ranch did not care about adjustment. The ranch required constant tending, and the tending required more hands than were currently available, and so Caroline simply did what needed doing and learned the rest as she went. She learned the well that it had to be drawn from in the early morning before the heat thickened the air, that the level had dropped enough to be alarming, that rain was urgently needed and not coming. She learned the animals, the 2 horses, a mule named Fletcher who had strong opinions about everything, a handful of chickens that were barely producing, 2 pigs. She learned the fields, which were beyond saving for this season but might be recoverable with water and attention in time for spring. She learned the children. Eli maintained a careful, watchful distance. He wasn't hostile. She'd half expected hostility and was almost puzzled by its absence, but he was reserved in a way that felt deliberate. He helped with the heavy work without being asked, answered direct questions directly, and otherwise observed. She had the impression of being evaluated for something she hadn't agreed to be evaluated for, and she tried not to let it make her self-conscious. Hannah was, in some ways, easier. She was a child who had been forced into responsibility too early, and she accepted Caroline's presence with a pragmatism that didn't require much emotional negotiation. She didn't need to be convinced or reassured. She simply needed, Caroline slowly understood, to be allowed to be 10 again. That was a slower process. The twins were a unit, not unkind to Caroline, but complete in themselves, requiring nothing from her beyond basic acknowledgement. Owen attached himself to her more quickly than she'd expected, appearing at her elbow during chores with the companionable persistence of a very small dog. Ruth continued to offer her the wooden spoon on a semi-regular basis, which Caroline accepted as the mark of genuine affection she suspected it was. And Lily slowly turned a corner. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where the baby was suddenly better. It was more that each day she was slightly less yellow, slightly more responsive, her cries slightly more vigorous, and her sleep slightly more peaceful. By the end of the second week, she was eating with something approaching appetite, and the lines of tension around Hannah's eyes, which Caroline now understood had been there for weeks, eased by a fraction. The ranch's finances were another matter. Caroline spent an evening in the second week going through Thomas Grayson's papers, which Eli brought to her without comment from wherever his father had kept them. The picture they painted was bleak. The homestead had never been profitable exactly. Frontier ranching rarely was, not in the early years, but it had been functional. That had changed. There were debts, modest ones to suppliers in Harlan Creek. There were larger, uglier ones elsewhere. The name Silas Crow appeared on 3 separate documents. She had heard the name once since arriving, a comment from Mrs. Halverson on her second visit, a tightening of the woman's mouth, a quick subject change. She'd filed it away and hadn't asked about it yet. She asked Eli about it the following morning. They were in the barn together, repairing the leaning wall section with timber and wire, while Fletcher watched them with profound skepticism from his stall. Eli was holding a board steady while Caroline hammered. Crow owns most of the land west of the creek, Eli said after a pause. His voice was careful. He's been buying up homesteads for years, or taking them when people can't pay debts. Your father owed him money? Papa borrowed from him 2 years ago when the well needed deepening, before... Eli stopped, held the board steadier. Before things went bad. How much? Eli told her. She set down the hammer. The number was not impossible, theoretically. In theory, if she worked steadily for, she did the calculation, 2 to 3 years, she might accumulate that amount, provided she had ways to earn. On the frontier in a place she didn't yet know, with 7 children and a failing ranch. When does he want it? She asked. By spring. He came out... Eli's jaw tightened. He came out the week after Papa died. To pay his respects, he said. He told me the debt stood, and that if it wasn't settled by the 1st of April, he'd take the property. Caroline looked at the barn wall, at the wire she'd just hammered, at the general state of a structure that needed more work than she'd initially thought. What do you know about Silas Crow? She said. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, I know that every family that's gone into debt with him has ended up losing their land. I know that the men he sends when he wants something are the kind of men you don't argue with. I know that the sheriff in Harlan Creek went fishing with him last summer. He paused. And I know he's wanted this land for a long time. Why this land? Eli looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, like a decision being made. Water, he said. The aquifer under this property feeds 24 wells in the valley. Whoever controls this land controls the water, and Crow's been buying up pieces of it for years. Caroline was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. Has your father mentioned any family? She asked. Your father's family. Relatives. Eli's expression changed in a way she hadn't seen before. Something closed off. No. I found a letter, she said, in your father's papers. It mentions a brother. The silence that followed had a different quality from previous ones. Cole, Eli said. The word came out flat and hard, like something dropped on stone. Tell me about him. There's nothing to tell. He picked up the hammer she'd set down and held it out to her. I'd rather talk about something else. She took the hammer. She looked at him. He met her eyes squarely and without wavering. All right, she said, for now. She went back to the wall and Eli went back to holding the boards, and neither of them said anything else about it that day. But she'd noticed what moved across his face when she said the name, and she cataloged it the way she'd been cataloging everything else that might matter later, carefully, without comment, and without forgetting. By the 4th week, Caroline had established a system. 3 mornings a week, she drove the wagon into Harlan Creek and spent the day taking in sewing work. She had put the word out carefully, not desperately, because desperation drove down prices, and had found a reliable small stream of mending, alterations, and the occasional new garment from families who either couldn't sew well or couldn't spare the time. She charged fair rates and delivered on time, both of which were apparently noteworthy enough that word spread. On the other mornings, she worked for neighboring families, washing, cooking, mending fences, helping with harvests. The Halversons were the first to offer, and through them came introductions to the Kowalski family, the Beauchamp widow, who ran a small dairy operation half a day east, the Chen family, who had a market garden and never enough hands during picking season. She kept careful track of every cent. In the evenings, she kept a ledger in the back of one of Thomas Grayson's old account books. Income in one column, expenses in another, debt in a third that she tried not to look at too directly. Progress was slow. The kind of slow that required discipline not to despair over. But she didn't despair. She was too tired to despair most evenings. She fell asleep with the ledger still in her lap and woke at 2 in the morning to feed Lily and then lay awake in the small hours doing arithmetic in her head until she fell asleep again. The children watched all of this. She was aware of being watched, by Eli most intently, but by all of them in their different ways. She didn't perform for them. She didn't try to be endearing or authoritative. She simply did what needed doing and let them observe it and draw their own conclusions. Hannah started helping with the sewing in the 2nd week without being asked. Her stitches were uneven at first, and Caroline corrected them without comment and waited, and within 10 days they were even. Owen decided on some private basis that his job was to make sure Caroline always knew where Fletcher's bridal was, since it had a habit of ending up in unexpected locations. He took this responsibility seriously. Ruth at some point transferred her allegiance from the wooden spoon to a specific rock she'd found in the kitchen garden, which she now presented to Caroline each morning. Caroline accepted each presentation with equal solemnity. Lily, by the end of the month, was recognizably healthy. She was small still, and would probably always be small, but she was alert and vigorous, and expressed opinions about things with an enthusiasm that suggested she had opinions to spare. When she was awake, she tracked Caroline's face across a room with the fixed, imperious attention of someone who had decided to keep close watch on a person of interest. Eli, watching this one evening from across the kitchen, said nothing, but his expression, for just a moment, was something Caroline hadn't seen on it before. The letter from Silas Crow arrived on a Tuesday at the end of September, hand-delivered by a man who rode up to the house, set the envelope on the porch railing without knocking, and rode away again. Caroline read it alone. It was polite in the way that certain threats are polite. The words courteous, the meaning underneath them not. Mr. Crow expressed his condolences for the loss of Thomas Grayson. He acknowledged the difficulty of the family's situation. He wanted to assure Miss Mercer that he was a man of his word and would honor the terms previously agreed upon, the debt to be settled in full by the first day of April. And then, in the final paragraph, a different note entered the language. He wrote that he was always open to alternative arrangements, that if the burden of the debt was onerous, there were other ways to resolve the matter. He wrote that he had always found the Grayson property to hold considerable potential that its current occupants had been unable to realize, and that he would be happy to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution at her convenience. She folded the letter. She sat with it in her lap for a few minutes. Then she went to find Eli. He was in the barn, doing something to a harness that needed doing. She stood in the doorway and read him the final paragraph. When she finished, there was a short silence. "He doesn't want the money," Eli said. It wasn't a question. "No," Caroline agreed. "I don't think he ever did." Eli set down the harness. He sat on a hay bale and looked at his hands. He looked older than 12 when he was still, she had noticed. Too much older. "He wants the water rights," he said, "and he was willing to wait until your father died to get them." She watched Eli's face. "Or help it along." Eli looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I don't know what I mean yet," she said. "I'm thinking." She thought about the debt that had seemed manageable once and had somehow grown, about the drought that had killed the crops, about an infant who had nearly died of what no one had been able to adequately explain, about a rancher who had died of fever, quickly, in summer. She thought about Thomas Grayson's letter, the one about his brother Cole, the one she hadn't yet told Eli the full contents of. "I need to tell you something," she said. Eli waited. "The letter I found, the one from your uncle, it wasn't old, it was dated 3 months ago." She watched his face. "Your father wrote to Cole. He wrote to him because he was worried about Crow. He wrote that he thought something was wrong but couldn't prove it and didn't know who to trust." She paused. "He asked Cole to come." Eli was very still. "And Cole never came," she said. Not accusatory, just factual. "Cole doesn't come when he's called," Eli said. His voice had gone flat again, the way it had the first time. "He didn't come when Mama died. He didn't come when Papa needed him 2 years ago. He doesn't—" He stopped, breathed. "Cole makes his own choices about everything." "Do you know where he is?" Eli was quiet for a long time. "I know where he might be," he said finally. "There's a trading post 2 days' ride north. A man named Rudder runs it. Cole used to use it as a stopping point." He looked at her. His expression was complicated. Resentment and something underneath it that was not quite hope, but had its shape. "You're thinking about sending for him." "I'm thinking," Caroline said carefully, "that by April we won't have closed enough of this debt through work alone. And I'm thinking that whatever Silas Crow is doing, having one more person who knows this land and has reason to fight for it might matter." She held his gaze. "I'm not making any decisions without you. He's your uncle." Eli looked at the harness in his hands, then at the barn wall, then at some middle distance that was probably more internal than external. "He'll probably say no," he said. "Probably. And even if he comes, he's—" Eli struggled for a moment. He's not an easy person. He's got a reputation that isn't... It's complicated. Most useful people are complicated, Caroline said. Eli was quiet another moment. Then, slowly, he nodded once. Not enthusiastically, not warmly, but decisively. Write the letter, he said. I'll tell you where to send it. The letter went out the following morning. Caroline rode to Harlan Creek to post it herself, and while she was in town, she did several other things. She stopped at the land registry office and asked to see the records for the Grayson property, explaining that she was managing the estate and needed to review the documentation. The clerk was uncertain about this for approximately 5 minutes, and then she produced the copies of certain papers from Thomas Grayson's files that established her role clearly enough that the clerk decided the uncertainty wasn't worth maintaining. She spent 2 hours in that registry office reading. The clerk brought her coffee once, which she appreciated, and then left her alone, which she appreciated more. What she found was not surprising exactly, but it was clarifying. The Grayson property had been flagged in 3 separate documents over the past 4 years: survey requests, boundary inquiries, and one document that appeared to be a proposal for water rights acquisition that had been filed and then withdrawn. All 3 had been initiated by the same legal firm in Wichita. She wrote down the firm's name in the small notebook she'd taken to carrying in her coat pocket. She also wrote down 2 other names she found in the adjacent files, properties neighboring the Grayson Ranch that had changed ownership in the past 3 years. Both had been acquired by a landholding company. The company's listed representative was the same Wichita firm. She thanked the clerk and went back to the wagon and sat in it for a few minutes with her notebook in her lap. Silas Crow was methodical. He'd been assembling pieces of this valley for years, systematically, legally. The Grayson land was the last piece he needed to control the watershed. He'd been patient enough to wait for the right moment. He was patient enough to use the law as a tool when it suited him, and to use other things when the law was slow. She was not a lawyer. She was a seamstress from St. Louis who had made an impulsive decision on a train platform. But she had 8 months of letters from a man who had known something was wrong, and she had a registry office that kept records, and she had the names of people in this valley who had lost land to this scheme and might, under the right circumstances, be willing to talk about it. She started the wagon and headed back toward the ranch. Overhead, the sky was beginning to show the first traces of autumn. Not yet cold, but changed in color, the particular pale gold of the Kansas sky when summer has finally decided to release its grip. The grass along the road had turned tawny. A distant smudge of cloud to the northwest suggested rain might finally be coming. She thought about the children, about Lily's voice gaining strength, about Hannah's hands learning steadiness, about Owen's careful guardianship of the bridle, and Ruth's solemn morning offerings, and Eli's watchful eyes measuring everything. She thought about the debt on the left page of the ledger and the numbers on the right and the growing distance between them. She thought about a man she'd never met, somewhere north of here, who had received a letter and might or might not choose to answer it. She set her jaw and watched the road and drove. The rain came on a Wednesday, 3 days after Caroline sent the letter north. It wasn't the gentle, soaking rain the valley needed. It was the other kind, the kind that fell hard and fast and ran off the baked ground before the earth had time to absorb it, filling the low places in the yard with muddy water that drained away by morning, leaving things almost exactly as dry as before. But the well rose 2 inches, which mattered, and the air afterward smelled like something living again, instead of something slowly giving up. And Caroline chose to take that as a sign of something, even though she didn't put much stock in signs. She was hanging laundry on the line the following morning when she heard the wagon coming up the road. It was Mrs. Halverson, Edna Halverson, a wide-built Norwegian woman in her 50s who had a directness about her that Caroline had come to appreciate more than almost anything else in this valley. Edna didn't soften things out of politeness, and she didn't elaborate things out of vanity. She said what she meant, and she meant what she said, and she had shown up with food twice and practical advice 4 times since Thomas Grayson died, and Caroline considered her the closest thing to a reliable ally she had currently found. "I heard you went to the registry office," Edna said, before she'd fully climbed down from the wagon. Caroline set down the shirt she was holding. "Word travels fast. Harlan Creek is small." Edna tied her horse to the post by the porch and came around the wagon with the particular walk of someone who had something to say and had been holding on to it since before she left home. "Claremont, the clerk there, he told Pettis at the hardware store, who told my husband." She stopped in front of Caroline and folded her hands together. What were you looking for? Records, Caroline said. Property records, debt instruments, water rights applications, anything attached to this land. Edna studied her for a moment. Her expression was unreadable, in the way of someone who had lived long enough to keep their reactions private until they decided what they thought. Did you find anything? She asked. I found enough to have questions. Caroline looked at her steadily. You've been in this valley 15 years. What do you know about the properties west of here that changed hands? The Dunmore place, and before that, the Acosta family? Something moved across Edna's face. It was brief and controlled, but it was there. Come inside, Caroline said. I'll make coffee. They sat at the kitchen table with the children out of earshot. Hannah had taken the younger ones to look for late-season wild berries along the creek, and Eli was somewhere in the north field doing something productive with wire and posts that he'd told her about in enough detail that she'd understood the outline but not the specifics. Lily slept in her basket near the stove, occasionally making small sounds that meant she was dreaming, if infants dreamed, which Caroline had begun to believe they did. Edna wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. The Dunmore place, as she said, Harv Dunmore borrowed from Crow's man, not Crow directly. It was always through a third party, to get through a bad season. The next bad season, the interest had climbed enough that he couldn't service it. By the third year, they were gone. She said it plainly, flatly, like something she'd said before, at least internally. The Acostas were different. Their debt wasn't money. It was a boundary dispute. Crow's surveyor came through and said their eastern fence was 6 rods over the property line, which it wasn't, but proving it would have cost more than they had. She paused. There were others before them. Ritter, the Swede family whose name I can never say right. And one family, about 8 years ago, the husband died fast. Fever, they said. The kitchen was very quiet. They said, Caroline repeated. Edna met her eyes. I'm not a woman who makes accusations without proof, so I haven't made that one. She set down her cup. But I've thought it, more than once. Caroline looked at Lily sleeping in her basket. She thought about Thomas Grayson's letters, the way the worry had surfaced in the gaps. She thought about his last letter to Cole, the one she hadn't yet shown anyone in full. Krobo is going to come for this land in spring, she said. I can't close the debt through work alone. I've done the numbers 6 ways, and they don't change. She said it without self-pity, the way she said most things. But what I found in those registry records, the pattern of acquisitions, the water rights applications, the same legal firm touching all of it, that's not nothing. If there's a federal examiner who looks at land fraud or a circuit judge who isn't in Crow's pocket, most of the judges in this circuit aren't, Edna said, with a firmness that was itself a piece of information. Crow's got the local sheriff and 2 of the county commissioners, but the circuit court has been clean mostly because the judges rotate through and he hasn't had long enough to work on any one of them. She paused. The problem is getting evidence in front of them. Crow is careful. He does everything through layers. The Wichita firm handles the paperwork, and the Wichita firm is 200 miles away and has better lawyers than anyone in this valley can afford. Then we need something he can't paper over, Caroline said. Edna looked at her with something that was almost cautious respect. You've been thinking about this. I think about it at 2 a.m. when I'm feeding Lily, Caroline said. I have a lot of time to think. Edna almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to her face, but it was close. What about the brother? Thomas mentioned him once, years ago. Said he'd had some kind of trouble. I've sent for him. Edna raised an eyebrow. Cole Grayson. She said the name slowly, the way you'd say the name of something you weren't sure was safe to pick up. I've heard of him. Most people out here have heard something, whether what they've heard is true. I don't know yet, Caroline said. But I know this ranch needs someone who can do the kind of work I can't do. And I know that whatever happened in his past, Thomas trusted him enough to write to him when he was afraid. Edna was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, in the way of a woman confirming a decision she'd already mostly made. What do you need from me? She said. Names, Caroline said. The families who lost land to Crow. Anyone who'd be willing to talk about it, who might still be in the valley. And anyone you know who has direct knowledge of how he operates, workers, hired men, anyone who's been inside it. Edna looked at the table again. That's a harder ask than it sounds. People are afraid of him, reasonably afraid. I know, Caroline said. I'm not asking for testimony yet, just names, just conversations. She held Edna's gaze. One person talking to one other person about what they've seen. Crow can't stop that. He can only stop it if it becomes something he can see and move against. So for now, I just want to know who's still here and who might listen. Edna studied her for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup again. I'll make a list, she said. The weeks that followed were a study in slow accumulation. Caroline's sewing work expanded. She took on 2 regular accounts in Harlan Creek. Mrs. Pettis at the hardware store needed alterations twice a month, and the school teacher, a young woman named Ada Frome, who had no time for domestic tasks and no talent for them anyway, commissioned a winter coat and then a second dress and told every woman she knew. By November, Caroline had more work than she could easily manage and had pulled Hannah in to help more seriously, paying her a small wage that Hannah accepted with a gravity that made Caroline's chest ache a little. She built the list of names Edna had promised her, slowly, through careful conversations. Some were harder than she expected. A woman named Patrice who had lost a dairy farm and simply refused to talk about it, shutting her door with a politeness that was its own wall. A man named Schuler who had been one of Crow's hired hands 2 years back, and who agreed to meet Caroline at the back of the Harlan Creek General Store and then told her almost nothing useful, his eyes moving to the door every few minutes until she felt guilty for having asked him. Others were easier, in ways that surprised her. An elderly Czech man named Novotny, who had been farming in the valley for 20 years and had watched 6 families go under and kept a mental ledger of every one. A widow named Josephine Tarrant, who had lost her property 3 years ago and then stayed in the valley because she had nowhere else to go, working for other families, and who sat across a table from Caroline one afternoon and laid out the mechanics of what had happened to her with a clarity that was almost surgical, her voice perfectly even, her hands still. I should have fought, Josephine said at the end of it. You didn't have anyone to fight with, Caroline said. Josephine looked at her steadily. No, she said. I didn't. She added her name to Caroline's list. The ledger on the debt was its own ongoing argument. Caroline looked at it most evenings, tallying what she'd earned, what she'd paid toward the debt, what remained. The total was not moving fast enough. She knew this. She moved the numbers around in her head late at night and could not make them behave differently. By spring, at the current rate, she would have reduced the debt by perhaps a third. A third was not enough. She was not ready to give up on the money strategy, but she was also increasingly clear that the money strategy was not the whole of the problem. Silas Crow wanted the land. If she paid the debt, there would be another mechanism. There had always been another mechanism. That was what Josephine's story told her, and the Dunmore story, and the half-dozen others she'd collected by now. The debt was a tool, not the goal. The goal was the water. So she worked the debt figures, and she worked the list of names, and she wrote 2 letters to a land office examiner in Topeka, whose name she had found in the registry records as the signatory on federal survey disputes, composing them carefully and then not sending them yet because she didn't have enough to put in them. And she waited to hear from the trading post north of the valley, where a man named Rudder might or might not have passed along a letter to a man who might or might not be there. No answer came in October. None in the first half of November. She didn't mention this to Eli. He'd given her the name and address and had not asked about it again, and she understood from this that he was doing what she was doing, waiting without letting the waiting show. What? The first snow came early that year, a week before it was due by anyone's reckoning, and it came hard. Caroline was in the barn with Eli when the temperature dropped and the first flakes started. Small and fast, the kind that meant business. They got the animals in and the barn secured and were running for the house when the snow thickened from flurry to proper fall, the kind that erased the yard and the road and the tree line in under an hour and left the world reduced to the circle of light from the kitchen window. All 9 of them were inside that evening. All 9, which was a number that still sometimes struck her sideways when she thought about it. 8 weeks ago, she had been on a train, and now this was her life. Owen fell asleep in the table before supper was finished. Samuel and Bess had engineered a disagreement about something that was probably not the real source of the disagreement, and Hannah had managed it with a weary competence that 15-year-olds shouldn't have. Lily had been fussy all day with what Caroline suspected was a new tooth coming in and had finally gone down in her basket after considerable negotiation. Eli sat at the far end of the table after the younger ones were in bed, turning a small piece of wood over and over in his hands. Not whittling, just holding it. He did this sometimes, she'd noticed. It was how he thought. "We had a letter once," he said without looking up, "when I was about 8, from Cole." She let the silence run without filling it. "He was in Montana, I think, or somewhere north. He said he'd been well and that he thought about us." Eli turned the wood over. "Papa read it at supper and then put it in the drawer and didn't say anything." He paused. "He never said anything bad about Cole, not directly, but there were things he didn't say that were worse than things he could have." "What happened between them?" Eli was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the snow continued. The wind had picked up enough to push at the window frames. Cole was with a man named Birch. They scouted together, worked cattle drives together, got into whatever kind of trouble those kinds of men get into together. He set the piece of wood on the table. 3 years before Mama died, there was an incident. A homesteader family, the Laredo family. They were moving through and their wagon broke down near a place Cole and Birch were camped. Cole helped them get the wheel fixed and sent them on their way. Next day, Birch and 2 other men robbed them. Took everything they had. His jaw tightened. Cole found out. He went after Birch. There was a fight. Birch died. The snow tapped against the glass. Cole said it was self-defense, Eli continued, and the Laredo family backed him. They'd seen enough to understand what Birch had planned, and they said so. The law eventually agreed, but the way people told the story afterward, he stopped. The story got simplified, and in the simplified version, Cole was just a man who'd killed his partner. And your father believed the simplified version? Eli looked up at her. I don't know what Papa believed exactly. I know he was ashamed of the association with Birch, of the violence. He was a man who believed in building things, not destroying them. Cole's life was the opposite of that. He picked up the wood again. And then Mama died and Cole didn't come, and after that Papa never mentioned him much. But he wrote to him, Caroline said, when he was afraid. Eli's hand stilled on the wood. Yeah, he said after a moment. He did. She thought about what that said about Thomas Grayson, a man who built things and believed in building things, and still, at the end, when real fear arrived, had written to the brother who had been stripped out of the story. She thought about what that said about Cole Grayson, that Thomas had still considered him worth reaching for. She didn't say any of this to Eli. Some things were better left to sit with. Go to bed, she said. The morning will be cold and the animals will need early attention. Eli stood, tucking the piece of wood into his pocket. He paused at the doorway. Miss Mercer. He said it in the careful way he always said her name, as though the formality was a thing he'd decided on. Yes. I'm glad you didn't get on the 4 o'clock train. She looked at him. He was already turning away, heading down the hall, but she saw the side of his face and thought, for just a second, that it looked more like 12 again, the way it should have looked. Good night, Eli, she said. The answer from the north came on a Thursday in late November, delivered by a man she didn't recognize who said he'd come south from the Rudder trading post and had a message for the Grayson place and wanted to know if this was it. It was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. The handwriting was heavy and angular, pressing hard into the page. It said, I'll come when I can. Don't expect me by any particular date. C.G. She read it twice and then showed it to Eli. He read it once, set it on the table, and walked out to the barn. She let him go. December arrived with a cold that had real teeth to it, the kind that found the gaps in the walls and settled into the corners of the rooms and made every morning a small exercise in willpower to get out from under the blankets. Caroline plugged the gaps she found with rags and newspaper and one creative application of flour paste that she wasn't sure would hold but did. She started the fire early every morning before anyone else was up. And by the time the children appeared, the kitchen was warm enough that Owen stopped doing the thing he'd started doing where he walked in and immediately crossed his arms and shuddered for emphasis. Crow's name came up 3 times in December. Twice in Harlan Creek, a comment in the general store, a conversation she half overheard between 2 men at the feed merchant that stopped when she walked closer. and once directly in the form of a man who appeared at the ranch gate on a gray afternoon and sat his horse there for 20 minutes without coming to the door, just watching the house. Eli saw him from the barn. He came to find Caroline in the kitchen. "He's still there," Eli said. "I know," she said. She didn't stop what she was doing. "What do you want to do?" She thought about it. "Nothing. He's not on the property. He's on the road. He's watching. Let him watch." She looked up. "If we run out to confront every man Crow sends to remind us he's thinking about us, we spend all our time reacting to him instead of doing what we need to do. He wants us unsettled. Don't give him that." Eli absorbed this. He looked out the kitchen window at the road where the rider was still sitting. "I don't like it," he said. "Neither do I." She went back to the stove. "Go tell Hannah supper will be ready in an hour." He went. The rider stayed another 10 minutes and then turned his horse and rode back toward town. She didn't let herself look at the window again until he was gone. By the time January settled its full weight onto the valley, the numbers in the ledger had improved somewhat, and the situation had not. Caroline had managed to pay down nearly a quarter of the debt, more than she'd dared hope for when she'd first looked at the total, less than she needed for it to matter by spring. The sewing work was steady but limited by the size of the community. The labor work was harder in winter, the opportunities fewer. She had 23 names on her list now. 23 families or individuals in the valley who had some documented or witnessed grievance against Silas Crow's methods. She'd met most of them, at least briefly. About half, she thought, might be willing to do more than talk. The other half were afraid, and she understood that. And she didn't push. What she didn't have yet was the thread that connected all of it, the evidence that linked Crow directly to the fraud, rather than the legal distance he maintained through his Wichita intermediaries. She needed something inside his operation. She didn't know yet how to get it. She was still thinking about this on a January morning when the cold had reached the particular depth where it felt almost quiet, when she heard Eli shout from outside. Not the alarmed shout, but the sharp-voiced shout of someone who'd seen something unexpected and wasn't sure yet how to feel about it. She pulled her coat on and went to the door. There was a man on horseback coming up the road toward the ranch. He was riding a dark horse and traveling light, with a bedroll and 2 saddlebags, the kind of load that suggested he'd been on the road for a while and was used to it. He rode straight-backed but not stiff, the way of someone whose body had long ago made its peace with the saddle. He was wearing a coat that had been good once and had not been replaced when it stopped being good. He pulled up short of the gate and looked at the house. Eli was standing in the yard, 20 feet from Caroline, and his stillness was absolute. The man on the horse looked at Eli for a long moment. Then he looked at Caroline. "I'm looking for the Grayson place," he said. His voice was low and roughened, the kind that had spent years outdoors. "You found it," Caroline said. He looked at Eli again. Then he swung down from the horse and stood by its head, and Caroline could see him more clearly now. He was tall, lean in the way of someone who didn't eat regularly enough, with a jaw that needed a razor's attention and dark eyes that moved over the yard and the house and the barn with the systematic attention of someone assessing terrain. Eli hadn't moved. "Eli," the man said, just the name, no elaboration. Eli's jaw was working. His hands were at his sides. "You're late," Eli said. "You were supposed to come when Papa was still alive." The silence that followed had its own weight, its own shape. The man, Cole Grayson, it had to be Cole Grayson, took that sentence without flinching, but something in his face registered it, something that looked like it had been waiting to be hit and had not been surprised by the direction it came from. "I know," he said. Caroline stood in the doorway and watched the two of them face each other in the January cold, and did not say a word. Cole didn't ask to come inside. He tied his horse to the post by the gate, unsaddled it with the economical movements of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and stood in the yard as though waiting to be told what to do with himself. It was, Caroline realized, a kind of courtesy, or at least the roughened approximation of it. He wasn't assuming welcome. She stepped off the porch. "There's room in the barn for the horse, water and hay." He nodded once and led the animal around the side of the house without further comment. Eli hadn't moved. He was still standing in the same spot, watching the place where Cole had gone, his face doing the complicated thing it sometimes did where it showed too much and nothing at the same time. You don't have to be around him, Caroline said quietly. Not until you're ready.
Eli's jaw tightened. I'm not going to hide in my own house. That's not what I said. He looked at her. Then he turned and went inside, and the door didn't slam, but it closed with enough deliberateness to mean something. She stood in the cold for a moment, then went to the barn.
Cole was settling the horse in the stall beside Fletcher, who was regarding the newcomer with his customary suspicion. Cole was talking to the horse in a low voice. Not words exactly, just the kind of sounds that meant easy. I know, it's all right. And he stopped when he heard her come in. How long were you on the road? She asked. 8 days. He straightened up. Longer than it should have been. The pass north of Keller's Crossing had drifted over, had to go around. She looked at him in the better light of the barn, the long, weathered face, the dark eyes that assessed things efficiently and without warmth, the old scar along his left jawline that she hadn't noticed from a distance. He was probably 40, maybe a few years either side. He looked like a man who had spent those years mostly outside and mostly alone. I'm Caroline Mercer, she said. I was supposed to marry your brother. I know who you are, he said. Thomas wrote about you. That caught her slightly off guard. He wrote to you about me? 3 months before he died. He said he'd found someone practical and that she didn't seem to want flattery. The faintest pause. He meant it as a compliment. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she set it aside. Did he tell you about Crow? Enough! Cole pulled a brush from the hook on the stall wall and ran it across the horse's flank. Not avoiding her gaze, just also doing something else, which she was already learning was his mode. He said there was trouble with debt and a man who'd been circling the property for years. He said he didn't trust the local law. He paused. He said he was worried about the children. He was right to be worried. She told him what she knew, the debt figure, Crow's letter, the pattern in the registry records, Josephine Tarrant's account, and the others on her list. She told it the way she told everything, plainly, without editorializing, letting the facts make their own argument. Cole listened without interrupting. He kept brushing the horse. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? He said. Practically? Someone who can do the ranch work I can't do. The barn wall's been repaired, but the north fence is a problem, and the spring planting is going to need more hands than we have. She paused. Beyond that, I need someone who understands how men like Crow operate their enforcement, what they'll do when the pressure doesn't work. What comes next? He looked at her then, fully. It was the look of someone recalibrating something. You're not just trying to pay the debt, he said. No, she said. I'm trying to make sure that if we do pay it, there isn't simply another mechanism waiting behind it. He was quiet again. Outside, the wind pushed at the barn walls. I know men like Crow, he said. I've worked for men like Crow early on before I understood what they were. They don't think of people as people. They think of them as variables in a problem. His voice was matter-of-fact, not confessional. When persuasion and legal mechanisms don't close the problem on schedule, they find other methods. And they're patient about it. They don't rush, and they don't improvise. They plan. That's what I'm afraid of, Caroline said. You should be, Cole said, but afraid in the right direction. The children's reactions to Cole were as varied as the children themselves. Ruth decided she liked him on the second day, for reasons that were entirely opaque and probably had something to do with the fact that he was tall and that she could stand on the porch rail and be approximately at his eye level when he was walking past, which he allowed with a patience that surprised Caroline. She started offering him the morning rock in addition to Caroline, which was, by Ruth's metrics, a significant honor. Owen was fascinated but cautious, the kind of cautious that expressed itself as following Cole from a distance of approximately 15 feet for the first week, close enough to observe but far enough to retreat if necessary. Cole was aware of being followed and made no comment on it, which was probably the right approach. The twins accepted him with a practical neutrality. He was there, he helped with chores, he didn't speak to them more than the work required. That seemed sufficient for Samuel and Bess, who had their own complete world between them and didn't urgently need external input. Hannah watched him the way she watched most things, carefully, from behind a composure that was built from real material, not just posture. She was polite to him and kept her distance and asked Caroline once privately whether he was trustworthy. I don't know yet, Caroline said.
But your father believed he was, when it mattered. That means something to me. Hannah absorbed this. Papa wasn't always right about people, she said. No, Caroline agreed. He wasn't.
Hannah nodded slowly and went back to her work, which was her way of processing things she needed time to sit with. Eli was the hardest. He didn't avoid Cole, had said he wouldn't and didn't. He worked alongside him without visible difficulty. He answered direct questions and asked necessary ones. But there was a wall there, solid and consistent, and Cole did not try to push through it. He also didn't do the thing that a lesser man might have done. The performance of remorse, the too ready explanations, the working too hard to be liked. He simply showed up each morning and did the work and let Eli decide what to make of that. Caroline thought this was probably the right instinct, even if it was costing both of them something. What Cole turned out to be, practically, was exactly what the ranch needed, and she hadn't known how to ask for. He knew animals, not just the basic tending of them, but the kind of deep familiarity that came from years of working with horses and cattle across different territories. Fletcher, who had accepted no one's authority since his original owner had presumably died or moved on, submitted to Cole's handling within 3 days in a way that Eli described as unsettling and that Caroline described as useful. The two thin horses filled out over the following weeks as Cole adjusted their feeding with the calm certainty of someone who had diagnosed the problem immediately and was simply correcting it. He fixed the north fence in weather that Caroline would not have suggested working in, going out 2 mornings in a row while the temperature was still below freezing and coming back both times with the job progressed and his face reddened from the cold and an expression that indicated neither complaint nor particularly great satisfaction. Just the equanimity of someone for whom discomfort was a familiar condition. He looked at the irrigation channel that connected the well to the kitchen garden and pointed out 3 places where it had silted up and one where the angle was wrong, and over the course of a week he corrected all of it. The spring planting would go into ground that actually had a chance. He ate what was put in front of him without comment, helped with whatever needed helping, and took the floor of the barn at night on his bedroll despite Caroline's offer of the storage room off the kitchen, which had a proper cot and a small window, because he said the horse sometimes had trouble at night and he liked to be nearby. She was fairly sure this was at least partially an excuse to maintain his own distance from the household, and she decided not to examine it too closely. Was ist beim. 3 weeks after Cole arrived, Silas Crow came to the ranch himself. She had expected him to send men. She had not expected him in person, and his presence in person was itself a message. The kind of thing you did when you wanted someone to understand the scale of who they were dealing with. He arrived mid-morning on a weekday, in a black buggy with 2 men riding alongside, and he came to the front of the house and waited to be acknowledged in the manner of someone who did not knock on doors. Caroline came onto the porch. Silas Crow was perhaps 60, heavy-built, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had become something harder through years of getting what it wanted. He was well-dressed in a way that was deliberate, not fashionable exactly, but calibrated to communicate substance, solidity, money that had been there long enough to stop having to announce itself. He had pale eyes that moved over the property the way a man's eyes move over something he considers already his. "Miss Mercer," he said. His voice was warm, which was the worst thing about it. "I've been meaning to pay my respects in person. I was sorry to hear about Thomas." "Thank you," she said. He looked at the house, the yard, the barn. He looked at all of it with the patient, satisfied attention of a man confirming an inventory. "I wanted to come and speak with you directly," he said, "rather than through letters. I think there's a great deal we could resolve with a plain conversation, and I've always found plain conversations more useful than—" He made a small gesture. "Than the alternatives." "I agree," Caroline said. "What would you like to say plainly?" Something moved in his pale eyes. A small adjustment, like a man recalculating. "You're in a difficult position," he said. "I understand that. A woman alone, 7 children, a property that isn't producing what it needs to. I don't take pleasure in difficult situations." "Well, he paused. "I'd like to offer you a resolution, a real resolution, not just an extension on the debt. I'd be willing to purchase this property at a fair assessment. You'd have enough to resettle the children somewhere with proper resources, a real schoolhouse, a real doctor. They'd have more than they have here." She looked at him for a moment. "The children's father built this property," she said. "He intended it for them." "He also intended to be alive," Crow said gently. "Circumstances change." "They do," Caroline agreed. "Where are you proposing the children go exactly?" He was prepared for that. He gave her a name, a placement agency in Wichita that handled orphan children from frontier families, a respectable organization, he assured her. "Separately?" she said. "7 children placed separately?" A fractional pause. "The agency does its best to keep siblings together when possible." "When possible," she repeated. The conversation had a surface and an underside, and both of them knew it. On the surface, it was a man making a reasonable offer to a woman in a hard situation. Underneath it was something else entirely, and they were both aware of what it was. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I'll think about it." Crow looked at her with those pale, assessing eyes. He was trying to determine whether she was stalling or whether she genuinely needed time, and he couldn't quite tell, and that uncertainty sat on his face for just a moment before he smoothed it away. "Of course," he said. "Take your time. Spring is still a ways off." He tipped his hat and turned his buggy around and rode back down the road. And his 2 men went with him, and Caroline stood on the porch and watched until the buggy disappeared around the bend. Cole was behind her. She hadn't heard him come out of the barn, but he was there. "How long were you listening?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. "He came in person to get a look at the situation, to see if you had support." He paused. "He was watching the barn while he talked to you." She turned. "And?" "I stayed out of sight." He looked at the road where the buggy had gone. "Crow knowing I'm here changes his calculations. I'd rather he not know yet." She thought about this. "Why?" "Because right now he thinks he's dealing with a woman and 7 children. That's a manageable problem by his reckoning." Cole's voice was flat, stating facts rather than delivering a speech. "When he finds out otherwise, he'll accelerate. He'll want to resolve this before whatever support you've built can be organized." He looked at her. "What have you built?" She told him about the list. The 23 names, Josephine Tarrant, Novotny, the others who had said they might, under the right circumstances, be willing to do more than talk. He listened the way he listened to everything, quietly, fully, without offering premature conclusions. "That's more than I expected," he said. She wasn't sure if that was a compliment or just an observation, and she decided it didn't matter. "I need something from inside his operation," she said. "Something that connects him directly to the fraud, not just the legal structure he uses to maintain distance. I've been trying to figure out how to get it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I might know someone," he said. The someone was a man named Devereaux, Luke Devereaux, who had worked as a surveyor for the Wichita firm that handled Crow's acquisitions until 18 months ago, when he'd had a disagreement with his employer over a set of instructions that he considered outside the scope of professional survey work. The nature of the disagreement, Cole said, was that Devereaux had been asked to file falsified boundary documentation and had refused. He was living now in a town 2 days east, working for whoever needed surveying done and staying out of anything that touched Crow's interests, because he understood clearly what touching those interests could cost him. "He won't want to talk," Cole said. "He's been careful for a year and a half, and careful has kept him out of trouble." "But he might," Caroline said, "if he thought there was enough behind it. If he thought it would actually go somewhere rather than just getting him killed for nothing." He looked at her with a directness that was becoming familiar. He'd need to know there were others, that he wouldn't be the only one standing up. She thought about her list. About Josephine Tarrant's steady voice and still hands. About old Novotny, who had watched 6 families go under and kept count. "Tell him that," she said. Cole nodded slowly. "I'll ride out next week when the road's clear. No promises." "No promises," she agreed. February brought the coldest week of the year, and with it, trouble of a different kind. She first heard about it from Edna Halverson, who came by on a Thursday looking more tightly wound than usual, and stood in the kitchen with her coat still on, and told Caroline that 2 of the families on her list had been visited by men from Crow's outfit. The Kowalski family, who ran a small farm and had been quietly supportive of what Caroline was building, had found their fence line cut overnight and a dozen cattle missing. The Beauchamp widow's well had been fouled. Someone had thrown debris down it, enough to make the water undrinkable until it was cleaned out. Neither incident could be directly attributed to Crow. Of course they couldn't. "He knows," Edna said. "He suspects," Caroline said. "He knows I've been talking to people. He doesn't know the shape of what I'm doing yet, or he'd have moved harder." "This is hard enough," Edna said. "Yes," Caroline said. "It is." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. The Kowalski fence, the Beauchamp well, neither was devastating alone. Together, they were a message. "I can reach anyone in this valley. Do you want to be next?" It was the kind of pressure that worked on people who were already afraid. It was designed to thin her list, to isolate the ranch, to make the people around her decide that proximity to Caroline Mercer was a liability they couldn't afford. "I need to go see the Kowalskis," she said. "And Mrs. Beauchamp." "Today?" Edna asked. "Today." She took Cole with her, which was both a practical decision and a calculated one. The Kowalski fence needed physical repair, and Cole could look at it and help organize the work faster than Caroline could alone. But she also wanted him visible, wanted the valley to know the Grayson Ranch had someone who could not be easily dismissed. At the Kowalski farm, a broad-shouldered Polish man named Alexander Kowalski met them at the gate with the cautious expression of someone who had been frightened and was not sure whether to admit it. His wife, Marta, watched from the porch with her arms crossed. Cole looked at the fence line in silence for about 3 minutes. Then he told Kowalski what materials he'd need and roughly how long the repair would take, and offered to come back with the materials and help do it. Kowalski looked at him, then at Caroline. "Why?" he said. "Because you're on this fence line because of us, partly," Caroline said. "And because this valley is going to need to hold together." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once. At the Beauchamp farm, the widow Mathilde Beauchamp met them herself and showed them the well with a calm, matter-of-fact anger that Caroline recognized as the anger of someone who had already decided to be furious rather than frightened, and had made that decision early, before fear had a chance to take root instead. "He wants me to be scared," Matilda said flatly, looking at the debris at the bottom of her well. "Yes," Caroline said. "That's inconvenient for him," Matilda said, "because I'm not." Cole cleaned the well that afternoon while Caroline and Mathilde Beauchamp sat at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours about what Mathilde knew, what she'd seen, what she was willing to put her name to. By the time Caroline left, Mathilde Beauchamp had moved from the general category of might be willing to the specific category of will. On the ride back, the sun going down ahead of them and the cold settling in with its evening authority, Cole said, "He's going to escalate." "I know. The fence and the well are warnings. When warnings don't work, the next thing is worse." "I know," she said again. He looked at her sidelong in the fading light. "You don't look frightened." "I'm frightened," she said. "I'm just not letting it make decisions for me." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she hadn't expected. "Thomas wrote that you were practical. He didn't say you were stubborn." "He didn't know me well enough yet," she said. Cole made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was the first time she'd heard anything like it from him, and it lasted only a second, but she noted it. Cole left for the 2-day ride east on a Monday morning, the sky flat and white with the threat of more snow. He packed light and told Eli he'd be back by Thursday, which was more words spoken to Eli in one go than he'd managed most weeks. Eli received this information with a nod and went back to what he was doing. But that evening, after supper, Eli stayed at the table after the others had gone to bed. He sat with his hands around a coffee cup that had gone cold and stared at the tabletop in the way he'd stared at that piece of wood in November, the interior looking. "He fixed Fletcher's left shoe," Eli said. Caroline looked up from the ledger. "What?" "Fletcher's left front shoe. It had been throwing him off since October. 3 different times I tried to get close enough to look at it, and he nearly took my head off." He paused. "Cole did it in about 10 minutes. Just talk to him. Talk to a horse." He shook his head slightly. "Papa used to say Cole could talk to horses better than he could talk to people." She set down her pen. "Do you want to hate him?" she asked, not unkindly, just directly. Eli thought about it, genuinely thought about it. She could see him doing it. "Sometimes," he said, "it would be easier if he was worse than he is." "Yes,"
she agreed. That's usually how it works. He looked at her. Were you angry when you got here and found out Thomas had died? She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said. Not at anyone exactly. Just, yes. What did you do with it? I got on a wagon and went to work, she said. It didn't go away. I just didn't have time to sit with it, so it moved around and eventually found somewhere to go. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, he should have come when Papa asked. He should have, Caroline said, and I think he knows that, and I think that's something between you and him to work out when you're both ready. She picked up her pen again. But I also think the fact that he came now is worth something. Not everything, but something. Eli didn't answer, but he sat there a while longer before going to bed, which was its own kind of answer. Cole came back on Wednesday, a day early, riding fast enough that Caroline met him at the gate with her coat half buttoned. He swung down from the horse and stood in the cold and looked at her. Devereaux will talk, he said. She felt something release in her chest, a tension she'd been holding so constantly she'd stopped being aware of it. He'll give us documentation. He has documentation. He kept copies. Cole's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, something taut. Survey records. Correspondence from the Wichita firm with specific instructions. At least 2 instances where the boundary data was fabricated and the firm knew it. He paused. And one more thing. She waited. He was present 18 months ago at a meeting between Crow and the firm's managing partner. He heard them discuss the Grayson property specifically. His dark eyes held hers. He heard Crow say that if the natural course of events didn't resolve the ownership question, he had other means to accelerate it. The yard was very still. In the barn, one of the horses shifted. Somewhere in the house, one of the children called something to another, and then it was quiet again. Natural course of events, Caroline said. That's what he said. She thought about Thomas Grayson dying of fever, quickly, in summer. She thought about the things Edna Halverson had said and not said about the family that had lost their land 8 years ago, the husband who had died fast. She thought about Lily, who had nearly died. He'll testify to this, she said. He'll testify to what he heard and what he has, Cole said. If there's a legitimate investigation, if he has some kind of protection. He paused. He doesn't trust local law. He shouldn't, Caroline said, but I've been writing to an examiner in Topeka. I have enough now to send those letters with something behind them. She looked at Cole steadily. If he files a complaint with the Federal Land Office, and we have Devereaux's documentation and testimony, and if I get the rest of my list to put their names to formal statements, Crow finds out he's under investigation and moves before it can close, Cole said. That's the risk. Yes, she said, which means we don't have until spring anymore. She held his gaze. How much time do we have? Cole was quiet for a moment, calculating. If he doesn't already know about Devereaux, weeks, maybe less. He looked at the house, at the smoke from the chimney and the lamplight in the kitchen window. He's going to find out eventually. Men like him have ears in a lot of places. Caroline nodded slowly. She looked out at the valley, the frozen fields, the dark line of the tree-covered ridge to the west, the long gray sky above it all. Somewhere out there, across the frozen ground and the winter miles, Silas Crow was sitting in a warm room calculating his own version of this situation. She thought about Josephine Tarrant's still hands and steady voice, about Alexander Kowalski's slow nod, about Matilda Beauchamp saying, "I'm not," with the calm certainty of a woman who meant it, about 23 names on a list that was about to have to become something more than a list. Then we don't wait, she said. She wrote the letters to Topeka that same night, 2 of them, one to the Federal Land Office examiner whose name she'd found in the registry records, and one to the circuit court clerk, whose address she'd gotten from Edna Halverson, who had gotten it from her husband, who had used the court once years ago over a property line dispute and kept the correspondence. Caroline wrote carefully and without exaggeration, setting out the documented pattern of acquisitions, the falsified survey records that Devereaux had confirmed, the meeting Devereaux had witnessed, and the names of families willing to provide formal statements. She wrote the way she'd learned to write things that mattered. Plain sentences, specific details, no language that could be dismissed as emotional or imprecise. She sealed both letters and set them on the table and looked at them for a moment. Cole was sitting across from her,
the lamp between them, reading through the copies she'd made of the registry documents. He'd been at it for an hour without speaking, which she'd come to understand was not rudeness, but concentration. "If these go out tomorrow and someone in the postal system talks," he said, without looking up, "Crow knows within a week." "I know," she said. "I'm sending them through Edna. Her cousin runs the postal office in a town 30 miles north, not through Harlan Creek." Cole looked up at that. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like the recalibration she'd seen before, the slight adjustment of someone updating their assessment. "You've been planning this for a while," he said. "Since November," she said. "I just didn't have enough to put in the letters until now." He looked at her steadily. Crow's going to figure out that something's moving against him. Maybe not from the letters, from something. He has people watching this valley. "I know, which is why the letters go out tomorrow, and why I start meeting with the families on the list this week." She folded her hands on the table. "How long do you think we have before he decides to stop being patient?" Cole was quiet, turning this over. "He's been building this for years. He doesn't want to make a move that collapses under scrutiny. He's been too careful for too long to get sloppy at the end." He paused. "But if he believes the legal route is being cut off, if he thinks there's a real investigation coming, he'll decide the risk calculation changes. He'll want the land settled in his name before any examiner starts asking questions. So he stops using lawyers and starts using the other men," Caroline said. "Yes," Cole said. "That's when it gets dangerous." She looked at the 2 sealed letters on the table. She thought about everything that existed in the gap between sending them and whatever response they might eventually generate from Topeka. Weeks, probably. Maybe more. The federal machinery moved at its own pace and did not rush for anyone. "We need the valley organized before he moves," she said. "Not just willing, actually organized. People knowing what to do and when." Cole set down the registry pages. He laced his fingers together and looked at the table. "What exactly are you planning?" "I'm planning that we don't face whatever he sends alone," she said. The next 10 days were the most exhausting of everything that had come before, which was saying something. Caroline rode out every day except Sunday, visiting every name on her list that was within reasonable reach. Cole came with her on the longer rides and stayed at the ranch on the shorter ones, keeping the work going and keeping an eye on the road. Eli managed the house and the younger children with a competence that no longer surprised her, but still, sometimes, made her chest ache with the particular grief of seeing a child who'd had to grow up too fast doing it well. The conversations were not easy. Some of the families received her with open relief. People who had been waiting for something to cohere, who had been frightened in isolation and found the idea of not being isolated anymore almost more emotional than they could contain. Old Novotny gripped her hand when she laid out the plan and didn't let go for a moment longer than a handshake required. Josephine Tarrant listened to everything with her characteristic stillness and then said quietly, "Tell me what you need me to do," and meant it in the absolute, unqualified way of someone who had been waiting a long time to say it. Others were harder. She lost 2 names from her list in those 10 days. A family named Briggs, who had children close to the age of the Grayson children, and who looked at Caroline across their kitchen table with eyes that said they understood everything she was saying and were afraid in a way that love made reasonable, and she could not in good conscience argue them out of it. She thanked them and left and did not add their names back to the list. And some surprised her. Alexander Kowalski, who she'd expected to be solid, and was, brought 2 other farming families she hadn't known about, a German family named Weisskopf and an Irish family named Callahan, who had both had dealings with Crow's men and had not come forward on their own because they hadn't known there was somewhere to come forward to. He brought them to the Halverson farm on a Thursday evening, and they sat around Edna's large kitchen table, 9 adults in total. And Caroline laid out the situation with the same plainness she used for everything. She told them about the debt. She told them about Devereaux and what his testimony could mean for a federal investigation. She told them about the pattern she'd documented and about the letters she'd sent north. She told them that she believed, when Crow understood what was coming, he would try to force the issue on the property before the legal mechanism could close around him, and that forcing the issue, for a man who had used violence before, meant something specific. The table was quiet for a moment after she finished. Callahan, a broad red-faced man with a beard that needed attention, said, "You're saying he'll send men?" "I think it's likely," she said. I think if we're going to stop him, we need enough people at that ranch when it happens that it becomes something he can't bury. And if they're armed, someone said. Cole, who had been standing near the wall and saying nothing, spoke for the first time. Then we're armed too, he said. But the goal isn't a gunfight. The goal is numbers. Crow's men are hired. They're not committed. They'll think twice before firing into 30 people. They won't think twice about 5. The room absorbed this. What if the timing's wrong? Weiskopf asked. What if he sends men when we're not there? That's the problem we have to solve, Caroline said. Which is why I need a system. A way to get word from the ranch to each of you quickly if it becomes necessary. What they worked out over the next hour was imperfect and depended on people being willing to move fast in winter conditions that did not encourage fast movement. A relay system. The Halverson farm closest, then Novotny's, then Kowalski's, then the others in sequence. Signal fires at night if it came to that. Eli on horseback as a messenger if there was time. It was the best they could do. Caroline knew it had gaps. She wrote the gaps down in her notebook and spent 2 subsequent evenings trying to close them and managed to close about half. The letters to Topeka, as far as she knew, were traveling north. Crow's next move came on a Friday in early March, and it came at the ranch in broad daylight, which told Caroline something about how his thinking had shifted. 2 men arrived in the early afternoon, not the armed riders she'd been watching for, but men in town clothes, one of whom identified himself as a representative of the legal firm in Wichita. He had papers. He said the papers were a revised assessment of the debt, incorporating accrued interest that had apparently been accumulating in a clause of the original loan agreement that Thomas Grayson had. The man said with performative regret, perhaps not fully understood. The new figure was nearly double the original. Caroline stood on the porch and read the papers twice and looked at the man in town clothes and said, I'd like to discuss this with my legal counsel. The man looked faintly amused in the way of people who assumed she didn't have any. Of course, he said, you have 30 days to dispute the assessment, after which it stands. They left. She went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and held the papers in her hands and allowed herself, for approximately 4 minutes, to feel the full weight of what it meant. Then she put the papers in the file where she kept the registry documents and went to find Cole. He was in the north field, which had been cleared and broken for spring planting, doing something with the irrigation channel extension they'd been working on. She crossed the field to him and handed him the papers without preamble. He read them. His face didn't change much while he read, but his jaw tightened once, briefly, at the bottom of the second page. 30 days, he said. 30 days, she confirmed. It's not about the money. It was never about the money. This is about buying himself a cleaner legal claim. If the debt is formally this large and I formally can't pay it, the property transfer looks more orderly. While whatever's moving from Topeka is still moving, Cole said. Exactly. She took the papers back and folded them. He's trying to finish this on paper before the federal question arrives. If he can get a legal judgment on the debt, the property transfer happens under that judgment, and it's much harder to unwind even if an investigation follows. Cole looked at the broken field around them. The dark, turned earth, the irrigation lines running toward the kitchen garden, the work of weeks, of months, visible in the physical fact of land that had been tended. What do we do? He said. We contest the assessment, formally, in writing, which buys us time, and we make sure Devereaux's deposition is somewhere safer than wherever he currently has it. She paused. And I think it's time I went to see the circuit court clerk in person, rather than waiting for a letter. Cole looked at her. 2 days' ride. Yes. I'll go, he said. No, she said. You need to be here. She met his eyes directly. If Crow decides to move on the ranch while I'm gone, I need someone here who can handle it. That's you. He held her gaze for a moment. She could see him working through the argument, testing it, finding that it held. Take Edna Halverson with you, he said. Don't ride it alone. She nodded. She'd already been thinking the same thing. She was gone for 5 days. She took Edna, and they rode hard the first day and got to the town of Merritt by nightfall, where they stayed at a boarding house whose proprietor looked at them with the particular expression reserved for 2 women traveling without male accompaniment, which both of them ignored. The second day they reached the county seat where the circuit court clerk had his office. A man named Aldous Ferris, who was 50-something and meticulous, and received Caroline with the mild wariness of an official who had learned not to assume he understood any situation until he'd heard it out. She heard herself described that way once, in a different context, and had considered it a compliment. She laid everything in front of Ferris. The registry documents, the documented acquisition pattern, her notes from the family conversations, and a signed letter from Devereaux summarizing what he'd witnessed and held in documentation. She was precise and organized and took 40 minutes, which she'd planned for, and answered every question Ferris asked with the same plainness she used for everything. Ferris read. He asked questions. He read again. "The Wichita firm is known to us," he said finally, not with surprise, with the tired recognition of someone who had been waiting for a particular name to arrive on his desk. "I thought it might be," Caroline said. Ferris looked at her over the documents. "You understand that filing a formal complaint initiates a process that will take time, and that the person you're filing against will have legal resources significantly beyond yours." "I understand that," she said. "I'm not asking for the process to be fast. I'm asking for it to be real." He studied her for a moment longer. Then he reached for a form from the drawer to his left. "Tell me your name," he said, "and let's begin." The formal complaint took 2 hours to complete properly. When it was done, Ferris gave her a copy and kept the originals and told her, with a care that she thought was genuine rather than procedural, that she should not make any assumptions about timing and that she should be prepared for Crow's legal team to respond aggressively. "I'm prepared for a number of things," she said. She and Edna rode home faster than they'd ridden out, pushing the horses as much as the march roads allowed. Caroline's mind ran the whole way. The formal complaint filed, Devereaux's documentation out of his own hands and into official custody, the 30-day clock on the revised debt assessment ticking. She calculated and recalculated, the way she'd done in the dark for months now, trying to find the gap where something could go wrong. She found several. She always found several. She worked on them in her head and closed what she could and noted what she couldn't. They arrived back at the ranch on the evening of the 5th day. Cole met them at the gate. He helped with the horses without being asked and waited until Edna had started toward her own farm before he told Caroline what had happened while she was gone. "Crow came," he said. She stilled. 2 days ago, him and 4 men, he came to the door. Cole's voice was even, but something in it was not. "Eli was the one who went to the door. I was in the barn, and I heard, and I came to the porch." She pictured this. Eli, 12 years old, going to the door. "What happened?" she said. Crow told him the situation had changed, that he was accelerating the timeline, that the family had 2 weeks to vacate, not until April. He paused. He said it to Eli, not to me. He was making a point. She understood the point. "You have a child answering your door. I can do this to a child. I want you to know that." "What did Eli say?" she asked. Cole looked at her. Something moved in his dark eyes. Something she recognized after months of watching his face, something that was not comfortable for him to carry. He said, "This isn't your land, and it isn't going to be." Cole's voice was quiet. He didn't raise his voice. He just said it. She stood in the cold evening air and felt something in her chest that she didn't entirely have a name for. "And you?" she said. "I told Crow the formal complaint had been filed with the circuit court and that the debt dispute was under legal review." He paused. "I don't know how I knew that. I assumed you'd done it. I was banking on you having done it." "I did," she said. "Then I didn't lie," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. "What did Crow do?" "He looked at me for a while," Cole said. "Then he told his men to turn around and they left." He paused. "He wasn't surprised that I was here. He already knew. Someone told him. She'd expected that. Eventually, it didn't make it better." "He'll move soon," she said. "The complaint changes what he can do legally, but not what he can do." "Yes," Cole said. "I think we have maybe a week. Maybe less." She nodded. She looked at the house, the kitchen window lit, the smoke from the chimney, the sound of the children somewhere inside. "Get word to the relay," she said. "Everyone on the list. Tell them it may be soon." The week passed with the particular quality of time that moves both too fast and too slowly at once. Caroline kept the household running with deliberate normalcy. Meals at the regular times, chores done. The children's lessons continued with Hannah supervising and Caroline helping in the evenings. She was conscious of the younger ones reading the atmosphere of the house the way children do, more accurately than adults want to believe. Owen had gotten quieter. The twins were sticking closer to the house than usual. Ruth had started bringing the rock twice a day instead of once, which Caroline had accepted both times with the solemnity it deserved. She did not tell them what was coming. She told them, when asked, that things were going to be all right, which was not a lie, but was not the whole truth either, and she held the discomfort of that as best she could. Eli knew. She'd told him plainly, the night after she'd returned, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp low between them, the way most of their important conversations had happened. "How bad do you think it'll be?" he'd asked. "I don't know," she said. "Cole thinks he'll send men at night. That's the pattern, when things like this have gone this way before. Night, so there's less chance of witnesses, so there's an argument afterward that whatever happened was an accident." She paused. "The ranch burning, maybe." Eli absorbed this without flinching, which was either courage or the particular numbness that came from having already absorbed too much. "The relay's ready?" he said. "Ready as it can be," he nodded. "I can ride faster than anyone else on this ranch," he said. "Faster than Cole. If we need someone to get to the Halversons fast—" "I know," she said. "That's what I'd ask of you. Ride, not fight." He looked at her. "What if—" "Ride," she said again, firmly, but without heat. "You keeping those children safe is worth more than anything else you could do on this property. That's not a small thing. That's the whole point." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded again, and this time it was the decisive nod, the one that meant he'd actually accepted it rather than just acknowledged it. Cole was a constant, steady presence in those days, moving through the work of the ranch with the same unhurried competence he always had, but she noticed that he positioned himself differently. He was never far from the yard. He knew, at any given time, where each of the children was. He slept lighter. She could tell from the fact that twice she heard him moving in the barn in the small hours when she was up with Lily. Not the sounds of something wrong, just the sounds of a man who wasn't sleeping deeply. On the fifth night, she couldn't sleep either, and she went to the kitchen at 2 a.m. and found Cole already there, sitting at the table with a cup of cold coffee in front of him, and his hands flat on the table, looking at the window. She sat down across from him. They sat in silence for a while. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. They'd gotten past the point of needing to fill silences some time ago. "Tell me something about Thomas," she said eventually. Not because she needed information, because it was 2 a.m. and they were both awake, and there were things that needed to exist somewhere outside of the people carrying them. Cole looked at the table for a moment. Then, "When we were young, 12, 13, there was a summer when the farm we grew up on went dry. Bad drought, worse than this one. Our father was not a steady man. He'd disappear for stretches." He said this without particular bitterness, just fact. Thomas kept the household going. He was 14. He traded labor with 2 neighboring farms, figured out where the water table was still high enough to dig by hand, organized the work, kept our mother fed. He paused. He was always like that. He saw a problem, and he figured out the practical solution. He didn't talk about it, he just did it. She sat with that for a moment. "He sounds like Eli," she said. Cole looked up at her. Something in his face, something that had been carefully behind glass, came slightly forward. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He does." She thought about 2 brothers, once close, separated by years and distance, and a story that had gotten simplified in the telling until there wasn't much left of the original shape. She thought about Thomas writing to Cole when he was afraid, the same way she suspected he had always reached for Cole when things got hard, and the fact that Cole hadn't come in time, and what that had cost both of them. "He didn't blame you," she said. "I want you to know that. The letter he wrote, the one that came 3 months before he died, he wasn't angry in it. He was worried, and he needed help, but he wasn't angry." Cole was very still. "You don't have to tell me that," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you anyway." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he reached for the cold coffee cup and held it without drinking from it, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was a man who was not accustomed to being given things without there being a price attached to them, and that he didn't quite know what to do when there wasn't one. "Get some sleep," she said, not unkindly. "One of us should." He almost smiled again. It almost made it. The riders came on the seventh night. She heard them before she saw them. The sound of horses at a pace that was wrong for the hour. Multiple horses, coming from the west road where the darkness was thickest and the tree line gave cover. She was awake. She'd been awake for the past hour, the way her body had started waking her at the same time each night without needing to be asked, as though it had decided to take the danger seriously on her behalf. She was out of bed before the sound fully resolved, pulling on her coat and boots with her hands moving fast and sure in the dark. She met Cole in the hallway. He was already dressed. "I heard them," she said. "5 horses, maybe 6, he said, "coming from the tree line." "Eli." "I'll wake him," Cole said, and moved past her toward Eli's door. She went to the kitchen where she could see the yard through the window. The moon was low, the light thin and unreliable, but it was enough to catch movement, shapes resolving out of the dark, horses and riders coming through the field gate that Cole had left deliberately unlatched 3 days ago, because a broken gate was an accident and a forced gate was harder to explain. The riders were carrying something. She could see the shapes. She knew what they were. Torches, not yet lit. Her chest went cold and very clear. Cole came into the kitchen with Eli behind him, Eli already pulling on his jacket with the focused calm of a boy who had prepared for this so many times in his head that the actual moment arrived with almost no room for panic. "They're in the field," she said. "I see them." Cole's voice was low and even. "Eli." Eli was already moving toward the back door. He paused with his hand on the latch and looked at Caroline. Just for a second, the briefest possible second, and she saw 12 years old in his face. The real 12 years old, the one that was still there underneath everything. "Ride," she said. He nodded once and went. She heard the sound of a horse leaving the back of the barn at speed, the deliberate, flat-out speed of a boy who was good at this, the best rider on the property, making for the Halverson farm across 4 miles of frozen ground in the dark. Cole was at the front window. "They're stopping in the yard. They're waiting for something." He paused. "Waiting to see if there's any response. They want to know if anyone's up." "Should we show a light?" she said. "No." He moved back from the window. "They'll come to the door first. Try to get the family out before the fire, or use the family's exit as confirmation no one's in the house. Either way." His voice was very controlled. "How long for Eli to get to the Halversons?" 20 minutes if he rides hard. Another 30, 40 before people can get here from the relay. "Then we have an hour, maybe less. We need to keep this from escalating for an hour." She looked at him. "How?" "We go out," Cole said. "We let them see us. We let them know the house isn't empty. Crow's men aren't committed to violence the way Crow is. They're hired for intimidation first. If they know they're looking at witnesses rather than an empty building, some of them will hesitate." "And if they don't," she said, "then we're still outside and not in a burning house," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached for the lantern on the kitchen table and lit it. She pushed open the front door and walked onto the porch. There were 6 of them in the yard. 6 men on horseback, the unlit torches visible. A 7th man standing by the barn with something that looked like a crowbar and was probably also a message. They'd been expecting an empty porch or a frightened woman, and they got neither. And the moment ran with the specific tension of a plan encountering friction. The man at the front, heavy-set, mid-40s, the look of someone who had done this before, looked at her and then passed her at Cole, who had come to stand behind her left shoulder without fanfare. "Miss Mercer," the man said. His voice was careful. "You and whoever's in there should ride out tonight. No need for this to get ugly." "The property isn't yours to clear," Caroline said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that, and also surprised by it. "A formal complaint has been filed with the circuit court disputing the debt assessment. Any action you take against this property tonight is a criminal act committed while legal proceedings are pending." The man's jaw tightened. "Who told you that?" he said. "The clerk who accepted the filing," she said. "I have the copy." A murmur among the other riders. She watched it move through them. The adjustment, the recalculation. Cole had been right about that. These men were paid for outcomes that looked clean and legal after the fact. A pending court filing made this anything but. "Crow's not going to—" the man started. "I don't represent Crow's interests," she said. "I represent mine and those of 7 children who have a legal claim to this property that a circuit court is now aware of." She let that sit. Anything that happens here tonight will be reviewed by that court in full light of day. The silence in the yard was the kind that leaned one way or another based on what happened next. And she had done everything she could to lean it in the right direction, and the rest was not in her hands. The heavy-set man looked at Cole for a long time. Cole said nothing. He didn't have his hand on his sidearm. He was just standing there, steady, looking back, and the steadiness itself was doing work that words would have undone. Another murmur among the riders. One of them said something quiet that she couldn't hear. Another answered. The man at the front turned his horse. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know," Caroline said. They rode out through the field gate. She tracked the sounds of them until they disappeared into the dark and kept standing on the porch until she was sure the sound wasn't coming back. Her hands, she noticed when she finally moved them, were shaking. Not badly. Just the small, inevitable shake of a body that had been holding too still for too long. Cole came to stand beside her at the porch rail. He looked at the empty yard. "They'll report back to Crow," he said. "Yes." "He'll be furious." "Yes." "This might make him reckless," Cole said. "Men like him, when they feel the situation slipping, sometimes they get careful and sometimes they get stupid." She looked out at the dark field, at the place where the riders had been. "Then we'd better hope the valley gets here before he decides which one to be," she said. They stood there in the cold, the lantern light pushing back a small circle of the dark around them, and waited. 40 minutes later, the first wagon came up the road. Then another. Then, in the distance, the sound of horses moving at a purposeful pace from the east direction, the Kowalski farm, the Weisskopf farm, the Callahans. Then from the north, Novotny's old wagon moving slow, but moving. Then Josephine Tarrant on horseback, alone, having covered 3 miles in the dark because she had said she would, and she had meant it. By the time the sky began to gray at its eastern edge, there were 31 people in and around the yard of the Grayson Ranch. Farmers and ranchers, and widows and laborers, and one elderly Czech man who had been keeping count for 20 years and had finally found something to count toward. Eli came back with the Halversons as the light strengthened, his face flushed from the cold and the ride, and he pulled his horse up at the gate and looked at the yard full of people, and something moved in his expression that was too large for any particular name. He looked at Caroline. She looked back at him. "You did good," she said. His throat moved. He nodded, once, and then looked away at the middle distance in the way of people who are feeling something they don't want to perform. Cole was standing at the edge of the porch, watching the assembled valley. He was not a man given to visible emotion, and he was not giving any now. But there was something in the way he stood there, looking at those 31 people in the gray early light, that told her the sight meant something to him that he wasn't going to say out loud. That was all right. Some things didn't need to be said. She walked back into her house and put the kettle on, because 31 people standing in the cold needed coffee, and because coffee was something she could do, and because some part of her brain was still running its careful inventory of what was finished and what remained. The riders had been turned back. That was one thing. Crow would know by morning that the tactic had failed. That was another. The complaint was in Ferris's hands. Devereaux's documentation was in official custody. The valley had shown up. None of it was finished. She knew that. She had no illusions about neat endings or easy resolutions. There was more coming. Legal fights, Crow's anger, the long, slow grind of formal process. But she stood in her kitchen in the early morning light, listening to the sound of people outside, and the kettle beginning to heat, and Lily making small, waking sounds from her basket. And she thought about a woman who had stood on a train platform with 2 carpetbags and a shaking world, and had chosen, for no completely rational reason, to stay. She thought about what staying had cost, and what it had built, and the long uncrossable distance between those two things. And she got down the cups and started counting how many she had. The coffee ran out by mid-morning. Caroline made 3 full pots, and it still ran out, because 31 people standing in the cold for hours will go through coffee faster than any reasonable calculation accounts for. And she stood at the stove looking at the empty tin and felt something between exhaustion and the particular lightheadedness that comes after a night of sustained fear finally releasing its grip. Edna Halverson appeared at her elbow with a second tin from somewhere, her wagon, probably, because Edna was the kind of woman who thought to bring extra coffee to a potential confrontation. and took the pot from Caroline's hands without comment and started the fourth batch herself. "Sit down," Edna said. "I'm fine." "You've been standing since before midnight. Sit down." Caroline sat down. The kitchen had people in it. Josephine Tarrant at the table with her coat still on. Alexander Kowalski near the door talking quietly with his wife. Old Novotny sitting in the corner chair with a cup he hadn't touched yet, watching the room with the patient attention of a man who had been waiting for something like this for a long time and was not going to miss any of it now that it was here. The younger children were still asleep, miraculously, through everything. Lily had woken at her regular hour and been fed and was now in Josephine's arms, regarding the crowded kitchen with the calm, imperial interest she brought to most situations. Through the window, Caroline could see the yard, the wagons pulled up along the fence, the horses tied, the groups of people talking in the early morning light. Cole was out there. She could see the shape of him near the barn, talking to Callahan and one of the Weisskopf's sons. Eli had put his horse away and was somewhere she couldn't currently see. The crisis of the night had passed. She knew that. She also knew it wasn't over. She drank the coffee Edna put in front of her and looked at the table and thought about what came next. What came next arrived in the form of a rider from Harlan Creek at 9:30, a young man she recognized from the postal office who rode up to the gate with the expression of someone carrying news he wasn't sure how to deliver and handed Cole an envelope that had come in on the early post. Cole brought it to the kitchen without opening it. She looked at the return address. Topeka. Her hands were steady when she opened it. She read it twice, carefully, the way she read everything that mattered. Aldous Ferris, the circuit court clerk, had written to tell her that the federal land office examiner, a man named Graves, had received her complaint and had been, as it turned out, already aware of the Wichita firm in question from an unrelated matter in another county. The combination of her documentation, Devereaux's filed testimony, and the existing awareness of the firm had been sufficient to open a formal federal investigation. A court-appointed examiner would be arriving in Harlan Creek within 3 weeks to begin reviewing land transfer records and taking formal depositions. In the meantime, all property transfer proceedings related to the investigation were stayed pending review. The Grayson Ranch debt claim, including the revised assessment, was specifically named in the stay order. She set the letter down on the table. The kitchen had gone quiet. People had stopped talking and were watching her. "The investigation is open," she said. "The debt claim is stayed. No transfer can proceed until the examiner's review is complete." The silence held for another second. Then Novotny, in the corner, made a sound that was not quite a word in any language, but communicated clearly in all of them. Josephine Tarrant looked down at Lily in her arms, and her composure, which Caroline had never seen crack in any of their conversations, showed a hairline fracture for just a moment. Something around her eyes, something that was relief so deep it had to be managed carefully or it would take her apart. Kowalski said something in Polish that his wife answered in Polish, and then they both stopped and looked at Caroline, and he said, in English, "This is good." "It's a beginning," she said. "It's not an ending. The investigation will take time. Crow will have lawyers and he'll fight every piece of it. But the stay means he cannot legally move on this property while it's pending." "How long?" someone asked. "Months," she said. "Maybe longer. I don't know." She looked around the room at these people who had come in the dark with no guarantee of anything except that they'd been asked. "I know that's not the clean answer anyone wanted, but it's what we have." Edna, at the stove, said, "It's more than we had yesterday." Nobody argued with that. What? Silas Crow did not come to the ranch again. He sent his lawyers instead. A succession of letters from the Wichita firm over the following weeks, increasingly formal and decreasingly polite, disputing the standing of the complaint, questioning the validity of Devereaux's testimony, raising procedural objections that were clearly designed to slow the federal process rather than answer it. Caroline read every one of them and noted what they were disputing and passed them to Ferris's office in her own correspondence as part of the record. The federal examiner, a spare, precise man named Whitfield, arrived in Harlan Creek on a Tuesday in late March with a clerk and 2 assistants and set up in a room above the land registry office. He was not warm and he was not cold. He was thorough in the way of someone who understood that thoroughness was his entire function and did not require anything else from him. He interviewed Caroline for 4 hours across 2 sessions. He interviewed Cole. He interviewed Devereaux, who came south from his town with the documentation he'd kept for 18 months, and sat across from Whitfield and said what he'd seen and heard with the particular relief of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has finally been given somewhere to put it down. He interviewed Josephine Tarrant and Novotny and the Kowalski family and Matilda Beauchamp and 12 other people from the list Caroline had spent months building. He also interviewed, separately and without advance notice, several of Crow's former employees, men who had drifted away from his operation over the years and were, under the formal weight of a federal examination, willing to say things they had not previously said anywhere. Caroline did not know the details of those interviews. She knew they had happened because Whitfield told her, at the end of their second session, that the record being assembled was more complete than he had expected when he arrived. She didn't ask him what that meant. She thought she knew. The night riders, the 6 men who had come to the ranch, were identified through a combination of Devereaux's knowledge of Crow's regular hired men and the testimony of one of the men himself, who had apparently decided that loyalty to Silas Crow had a ceiling that federal prosecution for arson and intimidation exceeded. 3 of the 6 were formally charged. The other 3 had left the territory by the time warrants were issued, which was its own kind of statement. The heavy-set man who had spoken to Caroline on the porch, the one who had turned his horse when she told him about the filing, was not among those charged. She didn't know how she felt about that. She understood why it had happened. She sat with it for a few days and then put it in the category of things she could not change and moved on. In April, spring came properly to the valley for the first time since Caroline had arrived. The irrigation lines Cole had repaired and extended through the winter carried water to the kitchen garden, which Hannah had planted with a seriousness of purpose that would have been amusing if it hadn't been so clearly earned. The north field was broken and planted. The chickens, for reasons that had more to do with the improving quality of their care than any other factor, started producing at a rate that actually meant something. Fletcher, for the first time in what Eli estimated was at least 2 years, allowed himself to be brushed without incident by anyone who approached him correctly, which Cole had quietly taught each of the children to do over the course of the winter in a series of lessons that none of them had been formally invited to, and all of them had attended anyway. The hearing came in June. It was held in the county seat, not in Harlan Creek, where the sheriff's loyalties made the venue inappropriate, but in the larger town where the circuit court sat. The building was a real courthouse, stone-fronted, with a clerk's office and a proper gallery. And when Caroline arrived on the morning of the first day, she found the gallery already half filled with people from the valley who had come of their own accord to be present. She sat in the front row with Cole on one side and Edna Halverson on the other, and she thought about the train platform in August and the 9 months between that moment and this one, and the distance between them felt both enormous and strangely small. Silas Crow sat at the respondents' table with 3 lawyers and the studied composure of a man who had been in rooms like this before and had always left them on his own terms. He did not look at Caroline when he entered. He looked at the judge, at his lawyers, at the documents in front of him. He looked at everything in the room except the people who had come against him. She thought that told you something. The hearing ran for 4 days. Whitfield presented the federal findings with the same thoroughness he'd brought to everything, walking through the documented acquisition pattern, the falsified survey records, the fraudulent debt instruments, the systematic coercion of families who had borrowed from Crow's various instruments and found themselves ensnared in terms that had been designed to ensure they couldn't escape. He presented Devereaux's testimony. He presented the corroborating accounts from the former employees. He presented the registry records that Caroline had first read in the Harlan Creek office on a September afternoon with the clerk's coffee going cold beside her. Crow's lawyers fought every piece of it. They were good lawyers, better than anything the Valley could have put across the table. And they found the gaps in the record and pressed on them with professional persistence. They characterized Devereaux as a disgruntled former employee with a personal grievance. They challenged the chain of custody on 2 sets of documents. They questioned the credibility of witnesses who had accepted what they described as inducements from Miss Mercer. Caroline sat in the gallery through all of it and kept her face still and let the record speak. On the 3rd day, Josephine Tarrant gave her testimony. She sat in the witness chair in the dress she'd worn to her own husband's funeral. Caroline recognized it from a description Josephine had given her once, without meaning to, in a conversation about something else. And she answered every question with the precision and steadiness that had characterized every exchange Caroline had ever had with her. She was not dramatic. She did not perform grief or anger. She simply told what had happened to her farm, step by step, with dates and figures and the kind of specificity that came from a woman who had spent 3 years carrying the weight of a loss she'd never been able to attribute properly. When Crow's lawyer cross-examined her, she answered his questions the same way she'd answered everyone else's. He tried several approaches, implying she was mistaken about dates, suggesting her memory had been shaped by her conversations with Caroline, questioning why she hadn't filed a complaint at the time. To that last question, she looked at him with a calm that was its own form of devastation, and said, "Because who would I have filed it with? The sheriff? The county commissioners? The same men who were fishing with Silas Crow the summer before my land went to him?" The gallery was quiet. The lawyer moved on. Old Novotny testified through an interpreter. His English was sufficient for daily life, but not for legal precision, and he had refused to let that stop him from being there. He listed 6 families, 6 names, 6 stories, the years and the properties and the mechanisms, one after another, the kind of testimony that was devastating not through its emotion, but through its plainness. 6 families was not an accident. 6 families, documented by a man who had been present in this valley for 20 years and had kept count because someone had to, was a pattern, and patterns did not happen by themselves. On the 4th day, the judge ruled. She would think later about what she expected to feel in that moment, triumph maybe, or relief, or the particular satisfaction of something long fought finally resolving. What she actually felt was something quieter and less clean than any of those things. The judge's ruling was thorough and unambiguous. Crow's fraudulent instruments were voided, the debt against the Grayson property dissolved, the land transfers in 5 other cases referred for further review. Criminal charges, the judge noted, had been separately filed by the federal authority and would proceed on their own track. Silas Crow sat at his table and received the ruling with the stillness of a man who had prepared himself for it, which itself told you something. His lawyers were already leaning in, already talking about appeals, already calculating the next angle. He would fight this. She had known he would fight it, and she had accepted that a long time ago. A ruling was not the end of a man like Crow. It was the beginning of a different kind of fight, longer and slower and conducted in rooms like this one. But he was diminished. In front of the valley he had controlled for decades, in a room full of people he had expected to be too afraid to sit there, he was diminished. And that was not nothing. She looked at him, once, directly. He didn't look back. She stood up and walked out of the courthouse into the summer light, and Edna Halverson put her hand briefly on Caroline's arm and said nothing, which was exactly right. The summer that followed was the first season since Caroline had arrived that felt like something growing rather than something being defended. The North Field produced, not abundantly, was the soil needed more years of proper tending to reach its potential, and Caroline knew that, but it produced. Enough to reduce the desperate arithmetic of the pantry, enough that Hannah stopped doing the unconscious calculation Caroline had noticed her doing every time she took something out of the stores, the silent tallying of what was left against what was needed. The ranch's small herd, supplemented by a trade Caroline had worked out with Kowalski for 2 calves, in exchange for 2 months of Hannah's sewing work and one of Caroline's, began to look like the foundation of something rather than the remnant of something. Lily walked for the first time on a Tuesday in July, crossing approximately 4 feet of kitchen floor with the absolute concentration of someone summiting a mountain, and sat down hard on the other side and looked around the room with an expression of total satisfaction. Everyone in the kitchen at the time made noise about it, and Lily responded to the noise by doing it again, the 4 feet of floor apparently having established itself as a known quantity. Ruth, who had been 3 when Caroline arrived and was now almost 4, had graduated from offering the rock each morning to a more diversified program of gifts that included feathers, interestingly shaped sticks, one very small dried frog, and on one memorable occasion a live beetle in a jar that she presented with enormous pride, and that Cole received with the equanimity of someone who had made peace with all varieties of frontier experience. He kept the jar on his barn shelf for a week before releasing the beetle with the ceremony the situation seemed to require. Owen had attached himself to Cole's farming work with the dedication of a boy who had found his element, following the planting and irrigation with an attentiveness that was less apprenticeship and more identification. He was becoming, visibly,
Someone who loved the land and understood it as a relationship rather than a resource. And watching him come into that understanding over the weeks and months was one of the things Caroline would carry with her for the rest of her life.
The twins, Samuel and Bess, remained essentially their own country. They helped, they participated, they were capable and present. But the interior world they'd built between themselves had survived everything, which Caroline had come to see not as exclusion, but as a kind of resilience, a closeness that had been their anchor through the worst of it. She stopped worrying about them and started simply appreciating what they were. Hannah turned 11 in August, and Caroline made her a dress. Not a practical dress, not a mended dress, but a proper dress with care put into it, green wool with small brass buttons because she'd noticed Hannah's eyes go to green fabric twice in the dry goods store and noticed her put it back twice. And Hannah received it with the composure she brought to most things and then went out to the barn for 20 minutes by herself. When she came back, her eyes were slightly red and she didn't mention it, and Caroline didn't mention it either. And that was how some of the most important things between them were handled. Eli turned 13 in September. He was, by that point, doing the work of a man, and had been for some time, and everyone knew it, and no one quite knew how to address the gap between what he was and what he was supposed to be at 13. He managed the farm labor with Cole in a partnership that had developed gradually over the spring and summer. Not warmly, not with the ease that years of familiarity might have built, but with a functional respect that was honestly earned on both sides, and was, Caroline thought, worth more than the easier version would have been. She had watched Eli and Cole find their footing the way she'd watched most things on this ranch, carefully, from a slight distance, without intervening unless intervention was necessary. There had been a conversation in the barn in May that she'd heard part of through the open door and had kept walking, because it was theirs and not hers. She didn't know what was said in that conversation. She knew that afterward something had shifted. Not resolved, not repaired, but shifted, and that Eli had come to supper that evening and sat at the table with the piece of wood in his pocket and hadn't taken it out once, which she had noted and filed quietly away. Cole never talked about what was said either. She didn't ask. On Eli's birthday, she made a cake, the good flour, the last of the stored honey, the 2 eggs Ruth had been enlisted to collect with great ceremony from the chickens that morning. It was not a perfect cake. It leaned slightly to one side, and the honey made it darker than it should have been, and she had miscalculated the fire, and the top was a shade past done. Eli looked at it and said, "It looks like the barn wall before Cole fixed it." She looked at him. He looked at her. Then he laughed. A real laugh, the unguarded kind. The kind that belonged to 13 rather than the older thing he'd been carrying. And she laughed too. And Hannah, who had been watching from the doorway, allowed herself a private smile. They ate the leaning, dark cake, and it tasted fine. The criminal proceedings against Silas Crow concluded in November. She followed them through the letters from Ferris and through the reports that made their way south from the county seat via the various channels of valley communication, which had become, over the course of the year, more connected than they had been before. The conspiracy charge, the fraud counts, the criminal coercion. Crow's lawyers challenged everything and lost most of it. He was convicted, stripped of his land holdings, which were ruled proceeds of criminal fraud, and redistributed through a court-managed process that returned the Dunmore property and 2 others to their original families or their heirs, and in 2 cases where the families had fully dispersed, held in trust with compensation paid from the dissolved estate. Stripped of his standing in the county, which had been considerable, sentenced to a term in federal custody that his lawyers were already appealing and would probably reduce through that appeal, because that was how these things worked, and she had never expected otherwise. She read the final judgment letter sitting at the kitchen table on a November evening with the lamp lit and the fire going and the sounds of the house around her. Owen and Cole talking somewhere outside about something involving the south fence. Hannah putting the younger children to bed with the particular combination of authority and tenderness she brought to it. Eli somewhere doing the thing where he walked the perimeter of the property at dusk, a habit he'd developed in the tense winter months and hadn't let go of, even in the calm. She read the letter and then she sat with it in her hands for a moment. She thought about Thomas Grayson, who had built this land and worried about it, and written careful letters to a woman he'd never met, and a brother he'd been separated from, and had not lived to see any of this. She thought about that often, and she thought about it then, without being able to resolve it into anything cleaner than what it was: a loss, a waste, a man who should have been sitting at this table himself. She thought about the people who had stood in the yard in the gray morning light in March. 31 of them, from every corner of a valley that Silas Crow had spent years dividing, because a divided valley was a controllable one. She thought about what it had taken to get them there, not just the letters and the relay and the plan, but the conversations in cold kitchens, the careful and unglamorous work of asking people to trust something that hadn't proven itself yet. The work of building, which was slower and less dramatic than any other kind, and which was the only kind that lasted. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known on the platform in Harlan Creek, that the work of holding something together, a family, a community, a piece of ground against the people who wanted to take it, was not done in moments of courage, though those mattered. It was done in the ordinary days between the moments. In the 2 a.m. feedings and the leaning cake and the careful ledger and the list of 23 names built one conversation at a time. It was done by people who were not particularly heroic in themselves. A seamstress from St. Louis, a hardened man carrying too much regret, a 12-year-old boy holding the household together by sheer force of will, people who had no special qualifications for what they did except that they stayed and kept doing it. She had thought once that staying had been an impulsive choice. She understood now that it had been the most deliberate choice she'd ever made, even though she hadn't fully known it at the time. You didn't always understand what you were choosing until you'd lived inside it long enough to see its shape. She folded the letter and put it with the others. It was Cole who brought it up, and it was not in a way she had expected. They were outside on a late November afternoon, the kind of day that was cold but not bitterly so. The sky, the particular pale blue of late autumn that had nothing harsh in it. She was mending a section of fence along the east side of the kitchen garden, and Cole was replacing a post 3 sections down, and they had been working in the companionable quiet they'd developed over many months of this. 2 people who didn't need conversation to be comfortable in each other's presence, which was, she had come to understand, not nothing. He stopped working and stood up and looked out over the land. She knew, from the quality of the silence, that something was coming. "I've been thinking," he said, "about staying." She kept her hands on the fence. "You've been staying," she said carefully. "I mean past what I was needed for." He turned and looked at her, and she saw in his face the thing she'd learned to recognize over the year. The cost of saying things that didn't come naturally to him. The careful bridging of the gap between what he felt and what he could put into language. "I mean permanently." The fence post stood between them, and neither of them moved. "Why?" she said, not testing him, genuinely asking because she wanted to know how he understood it. He looked out at the field again, at the plowed, dark ground and the bare kitchen garden and the tree that stood at the property's east edge where the children played in summer, its branches bare now against the pale sky. "Because I left once when I shouldn't have," he said, "and I've spent years understanding what that cost." He paused. "And because this is the first place in a long time where something was being built rather than taken apart, and I'd rather be part of building it." He looked at her steadily. "And because I think, if you were open to it, that there might be a way to do that properly." She looked at him. In another story, this might have been a moment of easy certainty, the natural culmination of months of proximity, the inevitable arrival of something that had been building in the background all along. But she was a practical woman who had been startled by life enough times to distrust ease, and she looked at Cole Grayson standing in the cold with the land behind him and thought about who he was, actually, as she knew him, not the simplified version of his reputation and not the idealized version of someone she wanted him to be, but the actual man, who had fixed Fletcher's shoe and cleaned Matilda Beauchamp's well and talked to Devereaux for her and stood on the porch in the dark and said nothing that was not necessary and everything that was, who had told Eli he was sorry without making the sorry about himself, who had carried his regrets without letting them become excuses, who was not easy and not without damage, and who had, somewhere in the long winter and spring of everything, become someone she trusted absolutely. "I'm open to it," she said. He nodded once, slowly, the way he processed most things, taking it in fully rather than performing a reaction to it. Then he said, "I should ask you properly." Not at a fence post. You can ask me at a fence post, she said. I'm not particular about that. Something moved in his face, the thing that was not quite a smile, but had its shape and its warmth. Will you marry me? He said. Properly. Not because it solves a problem, because I want to be here with you. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. He nodded again. Then he turned back to the fence post and drove it home with 2 clean strikes of the mallet, and she went back to the mending, and they finished the fence in the late afternoon light, and neither of them said anything more about it until supper. She told the children that evening. She told them plainly, sitting at the table after supper. The lamps lit, all 8 of them, in the kitchen together the way they were most evenings. Her and Cole and Eli and Hannah and the twins and Owen and Ruth and Lily in her chair, banging a spoon against the tray with the cheerful persistence of someone who had discovered percussion and found it excellent. She said that she and Cole intended to be married in the spring if that was agreeable to everyone. Ruth said, "Does that mean Cole stays?" "Yes," Caroline said. Ruth said, "Good," and went back to her spoon. Owen looked at Cole with the expression of a boy who had been quietly hoping for something for a long time and was now being told it was real and was not sure yet whether to believe it. "Permanent?" he said. "Permanent," Cole said. The twins exchanged a look that had a whole conversation in it and resulted in Bess nodding once as though confirming something they'd already decided between themselves. Hannah looked at Caroline with eyes that were careful and warm and old beyond her years and said, "Are you happy?" And Caroline thought about what a long road it had been to that question. She thought about what happiness looked like at 32, after a year of fear and work and grief and the slow, unromantic, necessary building of something real from the materials available. She thought it probably looked different than she'd imagined it at 22. Less smooth, more earned, the kind that knew its own value because it had cost something. "Yes," she said, "I am." Hannah nodded, satisfied, and began clearing the plates. It was Eli who was last and hardest, which she had expected, and which she sat with. He didn't say anything that evening. He helped with the dishes and went to his room, and she let him go. It was the following morning, before the others were up, when he found her at the stove in the early dark the way they often found each other in the early dark, and he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "You know he's not my father," Eli said. "I know," she said. "Nobody is saying that." "I know you're not my mother either," he said. "Not technically." "Not technically," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "But you stayed," he said, "when you didn't have to, when the train was still there." "Yes." He looked at the floor, then at her. "I think that matters more than technically," he said. She looked at him. This boy who was almost not a boy, who had carried more than any person his age should have carried, who had greeted a stranger on a train platform and told her the worst possible news and still found some thread of something to extend toward her. "Come here," she said. He came, and she put her arms around him the way she had never quite done in the months of careful distance they'd maintained, and he stood in it for a moment, stiff, uncertain, 12 years of defended self-sufficiency in the set of his shoulders, and then something gave way, and he held on, briefly, the way people hold on when they've been not holding on for too long. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then he straightened up and stepped back and cleared his throat and looked at the stove. "The fire's going out," he said. "I see it," she said. "Would you put a log on?" He did, and neither of them mentioned the other thing again, and they didn't need to. Back. They married in April, on a Saturday when the valley was green for the first time in the year, and the kitchen garden was already showing shoots and the children had been released from the usual morning chores in honor of the occasion, with the result that the yard was in a state of cheerful, moderate chaos by the time the Halversons arrived, and the Kowalski family behind them, and Josephine Tarrant, and Novotny, and the Beauchamps, and a dozen other families from the valley who had come not because anyone had made it a large event, but because people who had stood together in the dark have a particular interest in standing together in the light. There was no ceremony beyond what they needed. A justice of the peace from Harlan Creek, who read the words that made it legal. Cole in his best coat, which was not the coat he'd arrived in, but a decent one, Edna Halverson's husband had contributed from his closet with the gruff generosity of a man who was not going to make a production of it. Caroline in the green dress she'd made herself over the winter. Not the wedding dress she might have imagined years ago, but a good dress, well made, the color of new leaves. Ruth, who had been assigned the task of holding the ring, took this responsibility with a solemnity that exceeded the occasion in the best possible way. When it was done, and the valley came forward with the food everyone had brought, and the yard became something that looked more like a celebration than anything it had been before, Caroline stood for a moment at the edge of it and looked at the life that had assembled itself around her. Imperfect, complicated, nothing like what she'd come west expecting, everything she had not known to want. She thought about something Cole had said once, early on, that she'd turned over many times since. He'd said, "This is the first place in a long time where something was being built rather than taken apart." She understood that. She understood it as the central truth of the year she'd lived through, that the choice always was whether to be the kind of person who builds or the kind who takes. And that building was slower and more exhausting and required you to keep showing up even when showing up was the last thing you wanted to do. She had shown up. They had all shown up. And this, the yard full of people, the children running through it, Cole standing 20 feet away talking to Eli with an ease that had taken all winter to build and was still being built. This was what showing up looked like when it accumulated. Not perfect, not finished, just real, and theirs. Years later, when the ranch had become what Thomas Grayson had imagined it could be, the fields stretching green in the summer, the herd grown, the children raised and beginning lives of their own, people in the valley still told the story. They told it the way communities tell the stories that explain them to themselves. With some embellishment, with certain details sharpened and others softened, the shape of it changing slightly in each telling while the core stayed true. The woman who stepped off the train and stayed, the valley that showed up in the dark, the man who came back when it was almost too late and chose finally to remain. What the story kept was this, that the most consequential thing any of them had done was also the most ordinary thing. They had stayed. They had shown up. They had done the work that was in front of them with the tools they had, without waiting for better tools or better circumstances or some sign that it would be worth it. There is no clean lesson in that. It is not a comfortable truth. It does not promise anything about outcomes or timing or whether the thing you're building will survive what comes against it. It only says the building matters, the staying matters. The choice to do the work that is in front of you, imperfectly, with imperfect people, in the difficult and unglamorous time between the moments that stories remember, that matters. Caroline Mercer had stepped off a train with every reason to leave. She had looked at a barefoot 12-year-old boy with grief in his eyes and a family that was not hers and a future that had already collapsed, and she had picked up her bags and said, "Which way to the wagon?" That was all. That was everything.